My life has very been much like a horror film or a creepy horror novel, and recently I began contemplating on a strange and creepy story I grew up with, one that really isn't talked about in my family anymore, and when we do speak about it, usually we joke around about it as an attempt to lighten the mood, when in reality, it is nothing to joke about. My sister is about 5 years older than me, and on a side note, I hope she doesn't get mad at me for telling this story. And for a time before I was born, she and my mother and father experienced strange occurrences in our former apartment complex. My sister saw the film E.T., and it didn't affect her in a negative way. She wasn't afraid of E.T. She enjoyed the movie, and it didn't really impact her in any way other than the fact that she found it to be a good movie. Now, I'm not sure at what point my sister saw the movie, but I think it was at least a few years before the strange events began to occur. Sometime later, my sister began to act strangely. She would do very violent things for a child her age, throwing objects at people's heads, and just all around really strange and violent stuff. Most of it is personal, and I'm not going to get into it here. So at some point in time, my sister begins to talk about the being in her closet. She said the being talked to her and told her its name was E.T., that it was the same E.T. from the movie. This E.T. was the one who was telling my sister to do all those strange and violent things. My sister was bewildered. She was unsure what to think. At first, like most parents, she thought it was all in my sister's imagination. But then she began wondering about my sister's strange behavior over the past few months. One night, my mom decided to sleep with my sister in her bed. E.T. didn't come out and talk to everyone, but he did begin to shake my sister's bed while my mother was on it. It started slowly, then violently. My mom always told me it was like something straight out of The Exorcist. It really shook like one of those old hotel room beds. You know the ones? My mom jumped out of the bed, took my sister with her, and went to my dad's bedroom. Frightened, she explained the situation to my half-asleep father. Up to this point, my dad was very stern in his opinion on the matter. It was all part of my sister's childhood. She was just a kid, and this was all a part of her overactive imagination. But this time, my mom told my dad that if he didn't believe them, that he should sleep in that room by himself, while my mother and sister slept in my dad and mom's bed. My dad accepted it, as she just wanted to get some sleep. Sure enough, the bed shook on him too, and needless to say, my father slept on the living room couch that night. A few weeks later, everything returned to normal, and my sister was once again sleeping in her bedroom by herself. So this part of the story I've decided to remove. Basically, sometime after things seemed to return to normal, my mom experienced something truly horrifying in my sister's room, and at some point, my parents complained about the apartment to their landlord, and the landlord allowed them to move into the vacant complex directly above and across from their current one. After that, the events ended. My sister apparently still acted out from time to time, but it was really just normal kid stuff. Nothing as violent as those times in the old apartment. The old apartment sat vacant for a while. Eventually, a small family moved in, and to my mother's horror, they had 2 young sons. My mom waited a few weeks for them to settle in. Then one day, while at the washing machines downstairs, I think that's where it was, my mom asked the new woman who had moved in how she was liking the apartment. She had no complaints, but she found it strange that her younger son suddenly had an imaginary friend, and he claimed that this friend's name was E.T. And the funny thing about this was that the boy had never seen the film and had no idea E.T. the extraterrestrial even existed. This part of the story is where it gets fuzzy. As I said earlier, it's been a long time since my family and I have spoken of this story. Eventually, the boy stopped talking to E.T., but I'm not sure how long it was before he did. The family moved out of that apartment, but I don't recall how long it was. It may have been a few years. I think the family may have had a priest bless the place, but I'm not 100% certain. And eventually, my sister got a new bed, and that was when my parents found out where the bed had really come from. They had known that the bed came from my dad's parents' attic, but what they didn't know was that someone that my dad's parents had known had passed away on it. The person had died of old age, aka natural causes, but still one can't help but wonder if it had anything to do with the events. Maybe the bed was some sort of catalyst for what took place. The apartments we lived in weren't exactly old, and my family wasn't into the occult or anything like that. One theory my mom has is that maybe whomever lived in that apartment before us was into the occult and had invited some entity into the location. My sister was but a child, and we all know the theories around children and the paranormal, not to mention the bed someone died on, whether related or coincidence. Another theory is that something from my grandparents on my mom's side home had attached to her, but that's another story for another time. Thank you for reading. I have had one experience where a type of demonic entity descended on a lady battling alcoholism. This lady told me point blank that this demonic came up out of her deceased uncle at the funeral she was attending. The uncle was also an alcoholic and had battled the disease most of his life. Her family backed her story, relating that the uncle had often spoke of this demonic being. The lady was terrorized for nearly 2 years and eventually gave up the addiction. The family gave a long list of family members who had battled this creature and the disease. The belief was that when one family member died, it simply found another victim to adhere to. It took the form of a bat-like creature with an old man's very small head and face. I spent a great deal of time with this lady and did believe what she told me. This woman was about as tough as they come, but she would break down and cry every time she related the story. Right, let's start this off with the traditional I'm not crazy bit. On the 7th of April 2014, I decided to take my routine shower of the day. However, while I was in the shower, I kept feeling like I was being watched. We have 3 mirrors in the bathroom, and I swear I saw a dark figure. No facial features or any clothing, just a solid human-like figure pass through each mirror. It was not tall or anything, and it looked about average height, and I kept telling myself, "You are not here for me. You are not here for me." And the figure just vanished. Since the 7th, I've not seen it again. On the 9th of April 2014, my wife's father, who seemed in very good health, had a massive heart attack and suddenly passed away. His passing was so shocking that no one believed that he passed away. I personally feel that that figure was somehow involved. Fast forward to today, the 21st of April 2014. I was sitting in the lounge, and a picture we framed of my wife's father suddenly fell over. The reason why I am so freaked out about the picture falling over is due to the fact that we positioned it in such a way that it would not even move if the wind picked up. To add to the freakiness of the picture falling over, this evening, my wife asked me to make her and my daughter a cup of tea. I already had the kettle boiling and the tea bags in the cup. However, I reached for the sugar and placed it on my right-hand side. I then opened the cupboard to grab an extra cup for myself, and the lid on the sugar suddenly popped off the container and landed next to the kettle, which is also impossible as they are generally slipped on lids. My wife said it could have just been compressed air, but it gets open and closed multiple times throughout the day. If there's anyone that knows what the hell is happening, some insight would be amazing. I'm not a nut job or anything. I'm just very freaked out. I told my wife about this and she said that I may be open to things like this. In the past, I used to have really bad nightmares, but they stopped once we placed a bit of holy water in the room. I've not had any nightmares in around 5 years. However, over the past few months, they have started again. Anyway, I will end things off here. Any help would be much appreciated. Thanks for reading. When I was 16 or 17, I woke up to a symbol written on my mirror. I'm 37 years old now, but the question of what it was or where it came from still haunts me. The memory pops into my mind occasionally from time to time. Today, I thought of it for the first time in several years, and for the first time, it occurred to me that I might be able to find answers on the internet that weren't available when it happened. The symbol wasn't something that the steam in the shower made visible. I woke up one morning after thoroughly cleaning my room the day before. Both parents are ex-military. When I say thorough, what I mean is completely spotless, and looked up from my pillow to see it. Strangely, my eyes went right to it. It was like my subconscious knew it was there, but consciously, I had no idea how it got there. I was not scared. I was at a point in my life where I had felt most secure in my own spirituality. To explain, I identified with Native American spirituality because it was the closest thing to natural to me, but I hate labels. At the time, and even now, I felt an odd familiarity with rocks, trees, and the wind. Not animals so much, but I do like birds, rocks especially. I know this sounds freaking insane, hence why I never bothered to explain it to people. It's just how I polarized. I wasn't scared, but I wasn't sure what it was. I told my sister about it. She saw it, but I smudged it away. I assumed there would be no defining it, and I tried to rationalize it by telling myself I probably put it up in my sleep, but it looked like it was drawn with clear wax or chapstick, and there wasn't any in my room. But has anyone ever seen anything like this before? I would love to hear them if so. I've been dealing with addiction, and it seems to directly correlate with the strange phenomenon I've experienced over and over. Every time I engaged in this particular addiction, I would begin to experience strange, scary, and even threatening phenomenon. I could go on forever about all the experiences I've had if someone were interested, but I'm fairly certain that I would be deemed insane. For now, let's just say that I hear voices that sometimes give me information that I've never heard of, but I Google it and there it is. I began to use a recorder, an iPad app to record some of this. I have heard whistling so clear and realistic that I've searched my house inside and out, as well as set up cameras. To my surprise, I captured the whistling on my recorder. My wife heard it, but just denies anything out of the ordinary due to the fear of actually conceiving the possibilities. Also, I have 2 small dogs. On occasions, I could strongly feel a presence. My dogs jumped up from their beds and started sniffing and acting anxious. Once I sat down and used an app that measured EMF, and it suddenly showed giant calculations, and my dogs actually got up and run in front of me wagging their tails and sniffing the floor like I had thrown treats out to them. There's plenty more information that has no explanation, but is backed up by actual findings. If anyone wants to hear more, let me know. Meanwhile, I've made it clear that I stand my ground, and I'm no longer afraid, but I do have a real situation on my hands. This event happened when I was maybe 3 years old. My mom was cleaning around the house when I came out of my room and asked her to come to the bathroom with me because I had to potty and there's a man in there. So she went with me, and she couldn't see anyone, but she asked me to describe the man. I told her the man was a policeman. She asked me what color his uniform was because she knew the colors worn by the different law enforcement agencies. There's sheriff department, local police, and highway patrol, of course. Before I was born, I should note that my mother had been a dispatcher and deputy for the sheriff's department where we lived in Northern California. I said the man's uniform was tan, which meant highway patrol. As we left the bathroom, I pointed into my bedroom and said, "There's another one in there." I described how the men had been shooted with a shoot gun, one in the elbow and stomach, one in the knee, as well as other places. I don't remember exactly where, unfortunately. From the fact that 2 murdered CHP officers appeared to be hanging around in her house, my mom knew who they had to have been. After all, she didn't know very many people who had been murdered. I'm not writing their names because I don't know if there could be an legal fallout from doing so. I can't think why there would be, but just to be on the safe side. Some time passed, and my mom told the story to a friend of hers who still worked for the sheriff's department. The fact that one officer had been shot in the elbow was one of the details that was withheld from the public as the cops investigated the crime. Even my mother hadn't known about that, but because of that, she was able to confirm her guess about the identities of the dead officers. On December 22nd, 1978, the 2 officers, one of them a friend of my mother's, had made a vehicle stop on a stolen car. The drivers somehow managed to get control of their weapons, shot one in the knee and one in the elbow, disabling them, and killed both of them with their own service revolvers. The officers were not expecting a fight and were caught off guard, and theirs was the only CHP car in the county that night, due to state-mandated cutbacks and nightmare patrols. At the time I saw the ghosts, the case would have been just going to trial. The murdered family. I lived in an old 2-story house. I did not like it there. I just felt like there was a presence watching me in my bathroom and room. By the way, the house is made of wood. I see just for a second a shadow running across the room and into the bathroom. All my stuff is misplaced all the time. It's frightening. So I did some research and found out a horrible murder took place here. A family of 3 was murdered here in the room and bathroom. It seems that the father of a poor family made an enemy of a mean neighbor. One day, the father humiliated the neighbor in front of a town not far from the house. The neighbor was, of course, very mad. At night, the neighbor snuck into her house. He grabbed a knife and slit the father's throat in the same bed I sleep in. His son came in there wondering what the noise was all about. When he saw his father dead, he screamed. The scream woke the mother. The neighbor cut the boy in the chest and killed him. The mother fled to the bathroom and locked the door. When the killer got in, he stabbed the mother repeatedly. There was blood all over the place. The neighbor was scared, so he committed suicide. When I told my parents, they were shocked. So 1 week later, we moved to Texas. I'm glad I am out of that house, but it was pretty interesting. I was 15 then, and now I'm 31. Murdered friend is still about. I find it strange that I'm sharing a story that is so personal to me, but I would just like to get some understanding from it. I come from Manhattan, and I'm still currently living there. It starts from 2002 when my father, brought up in the Bronx, but moved to the Upper East Side, decided to give back to his community, since it has, he says, made him who he is today. He set up a graffiti club, as I should put it, where kids in rougher neighborhoods could come off and get off the streets and express their emotions through their art. It was pretty successful. Some trouble here and there, but overall it went pretty great. I decided to go, of course, and I befriended some people who, if it wasn't for the club, I would never have thought they'd be friends with me. Cut the long story short, I really got on with Jay. Jay, not his real name, but for privacy's sake, with whom I could have so many laughs with. Tragically, in early 2003, he was shot down in Harlem, where he came from. It was a tragic blow to the club and me personally. It affected me more than I could ever explain. It hurts and still does now just to think about him. I visited the spot a few weeks later. I bent down and cried with my head in my hands. As I did, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I heard a laugh, then a mumble I will never even make out myself. But I think it sounded like, "Don't cry about me" or something. I thought I was a respectful person, yet seconds later when I stood and turned, nobody was there. I wasn't frightened. I just assumed it was someone who walked off fast. Driving back home, still crying, I stopped at a light. I wiped my eyes and looked out the driver's window at some girls playing double dutch. On the steps of the building beside them, I could have sworn I saw Jay. I was so convinced that I shouted his name. The kids were bewildered at who I was shouting at, and the man I saw didn't even look towards me. His eyes just stayed fixated somewhere over the top of the car. I drove off fast, sure that I was going crazy. It wasn't until the club stopped in 2005 that strange things happened once again. As I prepared food in the kitchen, my music player blasted a Tupac song. I think it's called Hold Your Head. It was an album from the Don Killuminati, the 7 Day Theory, which Jay persuaded me to buy, but I'd never listened to it since the day I'd buy it. This overwhelming feeling of happiness came over me, even though I knew I should be scared as for how a CD had got out of my bedroom closet into the stereo in my living room and then played by itself. I walked into the living room, smiling and silently laughing, and then I heard a laugh, very loud, coming from by the hallway. I then became scared, even though I was so familiar with that laugh. I just stood there, burst into tears, and that feeling, that gutted feeling I felt all those years ago. That night, as I got into my bed, my bedroom door opened. Thinking it was my cat, I got up and closed it, of course. Now this is the part that I find so unbelievable and disturbing to think about. Halfway down the hallway, a figure stood, just dark with no features at all. It stood directly in front of a picture Jay and another kid had created. For about a minute I stood there bewildered, too scared to move, staring at the figure that barely moved. Then I just slammed my door, ran to my bed like a child. Since then, I've never seen anything like that, but sometimes I don't feel alone in my home, and channels on TV have the tendency to switch to certain music channels. I've never told anybody except my best friend and my father. On here, I'm hoping people are more open-minded and help me understand what happened. Even though I never believed in the paranormal, I really do think Jay is around me at times, which makes me feel so happy to know. It really does scare me, the idea of a ghost, but if it is of Jay, I know he's only there to joke around and just see if I'm okay. But I can't help thinking that people become ghosts on Earth because they are stopped from going into the afterlife, because they have some unfinished business to attend to. Thank you for allowing me to share the story, which has been bothering me for so long. The Ghost Girl in the Mirror. This is a true story that happened when I was around 11 years old. It is so far the only ghost experience I have ever had, but it is one of the scariest moments ever. I was in middle school when this whole experience occurred. We have 2 bathrooms for girls and boys, the downstairs bathrooms and the upstairs ones. Everyone knows about the upstairs girls' bathroom. The reason is, whenever you go in there, you always feel really weird. It feels cold, and basically just gives you a feeling of distortion. Because I was with the older students, all our classes were upstairs. So if we needed the toilet, we had to use the upstairs ones. Anyway, one lesson, I needed to go really bad. I had no choice but to use the bathroom upstairs. I walk into the girls' bathroom and immediately get that familiar sense of disorientation. I rush into the cubicle, all the while feeling this freezing cold energy. Despite it being a lovely warm day, my heart was pounding. The feeling of panic was rising. I just wanted to get out of there quickly. I opened the cubicle door and headed for the sinks. Even though I was terrified, I was still a freak about germs. I quickly washed my hands and glanced at the mirror in front of me. My heart literally stopped. My eyes went wide. In the mirror's reflection, I kid you not, was a young girl right beside me. She was turned to the left, making a clapping gesture with her hands and eyes closed. I only saw her for about 2 seconds before I shot out of there, screaming. I assure you, I was the only one in there the entire time. The bathroom door is a very large one. You can certainly hear it if someone comes in or leaves. When I first entered, the room was empty, and all the cubicle doors were swinged open. So I am positive nobody was in there but me. Besides, when I left the cubicle, it was still empty. I only saw this girl in the reflection. I never went to that bathroom again, and now I moved up to high school. My friend has a familiar experience in the same bathroom, but that's for another day. In January 2000, we lost my dad because of a doctor's error during surgery. As we were all very close to him, this all hit us particularly hard. I decided to move back with my mom. I was 24 at the time, and I took care of her. I've been with her ever since. It has now been nearly 7 years since his death. Before my dad died, I didn't believe in anything paranormal. I believed in what I learned at church, but I did not believe in ghosts or hauntings, even though I had experienced a few inexplicable things myself. I brushed them all off as weird phenomena, but nothing to concern myself with, and certainly nothing to change my views about, until spring 2005. When my dad passed away, we began having trouble with people messing around the house. There were a few things stolen from my dad's work building, and there were 3 batteries stolen right from the vehicles while Mom and I watched out a window after placing a frantic phone call to the police. The police didn't show up until some time later, and by then, the burglars were gone. Occurrences of this nature would happen time and time again. Spring 2005, I was up late one night, 1 a.m. or later, studying for finals in my bedroom. Everything was quiet and dark. The only light on in my house was in my bedroom. We lived in a very rural area, so when it gets dark and quiet, it really gets dark and quiet. I was engrossed in my studying when my dogs began barking. I sighed, realizing that someone was probably out there, but there was really nothing I could actually do about it since we lived so far away from a police station. They had already stolen most of everything of any value, and they never had tried to get in the house before, so I went back to studying. I'd become engrossed in my studying to the point that I didn't even really notice the dogs barking anymore, when suddenly, my bedroom filled with the overwhelming scent of my dad's cologne. But it wasn't just the smell of the cologne. You know how different perfumes and colognes smell different on different people because of differentiating body chemistries? Well, this was my dad wearing the cologne. I looked up, fully expecting to see him, but nothing was there. The scent was getting stronger and stronger. It was then that I noticed the urgent pitch of the dogs barking and growling, and the rustling coming from outside underneath my bedroom window. There was someone out there. Suddenly, Daddy's scent centered at the window beside the bed where I was working, and seemed to become malevolent. Don't ask me how I know this, I just do. It's like the air seemed to crackle. It was then that I heard someone running away breakneck from the house, without even bothering to try to be quiet. The atmosphere in the room suddenly went from malevolent to peaceful, and Daddy's scent lingered for a moment and then was gone. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I can't deny it. I would like to think that he's still here, watching over those he loves. It made me feel very safe and taken care of. Not once did I feel one bit of fear over the scent in my room. Thanks for reading. I have yet another story to tell. I guess I am susceptible to spirits and apparitions, as I've had other encounters with loved ones who have passed. This one was my very first encounter. I was going through a very bitter divorce, being only 28 and afraid to be alone with 2 very little boys. I didn't know which end was up, so to speak. It was in the summer. I had my 2 babies bathed and in bed. I decided to lay on the sofa and watch some television. I fell asleep, a pretty deep sleep at that. I was awoken by the static of the television. The station had gone off the air for the night. My baby of 10 months old had the bedroom right off of the living room. The sofa was facing his room, and he was sleeping soundly. I had a habit of keeping all of the bedroom doors open at night so that if one of my sons cried, I would hear them. All of a sudden, the living room got so cold, like a very damp chill. A glowing light appeared at the doorway of my baby's room. Then a figure appeared, a woman, in a long white dress and dark hair. Her hair was up in an upsweep, but I couldn't make out her face. Her face was blurry, and I just couldn't see it at all. I was shocked, couldn't move, mind racing and heart pounding like crazy. I sat up on the sofa and just stared at this figure in the doorway of my baby's room. Then she spoke, only a few words, but she spoke. She said it will be all right. Then she vanished into thin air. That damp chill vanished along with the apparition. I was so shaken by this, not knowing who it was or what it was about. I eventually calmed down and put it out of my mind. A few days later, my mom and dad came up for a visit. They loved their grandbaby so much, they came to visit several times a week. We were sitting at the table in the kitchen, just chatting about anything and everything. That's when I thought of the strange happening I experienced a few nights before. I told my folks about what had happened and described the figure that I saw that night to my parents. I mentioned too how cold and damp it got in that room that night and how the chill went away when the figure went away. My dad sat there, looking at me with the eyes of dinner plates and had a stunned look on his face. I asked him if he was okay. He said that he was, but he knew who that figure was. I asked him who that could have been, and he said it was his mother. He was only 7 when his mother died. She was only 34 years old. She died a week after her 9th child was born. She had all of her children in the farmhouse where her and my grandfather lived. Dad used to sit at his desk in a one-room schoolhouse and look out at her grave. The cemetery was right next door to the schoolhouse. I asked him how he knew it was his mother. He said the way I described her, wearing a long white dress, and the color and style of her hair. Her hair was dark and always in an upsweep, but this part is what really convinced me that he was right. He told me that she would always use that expression, "It will be alright," to him and his brothers and sisters when things didn't go quite right. He said he just knew it was her. He said she was comforting me and telling me that everything would get better. I was quite amazed, not only by the fact that I never saw my grandmother, but how she came to visit me in my times of need. I never had any other encounters with her after that visit, though I felt a calmness inside of me and felt somehow closer to her after that hot summer night. Thank you for reading my story. I hope you enjoyed reading it. I had visited my mother on Monday afternoon, after she and I had a disagreement on the Saturday before. She had called me on a Saturday afternoon and told me she needed to come to her house. I lived in the country at the time, and she lived about 10 miles from me. I'd just been in town with my youngest 2 sons for baseball practice. I also had just taken my only transportation to the shop to have new tires put on, so I had no vehicle to take me anywhere for the day. Our conversation escalated into an argument quickly, and I ended up hanging up the phone after she had not stopped her insistence that I come to her house immediately. She was never this insistent over me coming to pick up some fresh veggies she had gotten from her early garden. On Sunday, I was stubborn, and though I could have gone in to visit all day, I stayed at home. On Monday, I'd taken off work a little early to go to school to watch my sons in a spring sports day. I had about 45 minutes after the sports events before they would be out of school, and I went to see my mother. We talked, and our argument from Saturday was completely forgotten. She and I talked about all 3 of my sons. My oldest is 8 years older than my younger and 10 years older than my youngest, so he was in college and doing well. She told me that she had some problems with asthma lately, but she wasn't going to let it get the best of her. I told her she should really go to the doctor because asthma might not be something to ignore. She said she would be fine. On Tuesday morning, around 2 o'clock, I got a phone call that they were on their way to the hospital with her. I got up, dressed quickly, and drove into the hospital. About 20 blocks from the hospital, I was at a spotlight and thinking that I could run the light because I was the only car around, when I had a warm and comforting feeling fill me. Something told me to take it easy. She was okay and in heaven. Really, it was such a grateful feeling of peace. I got to the hospital, and I knew for sure the way the receptionist at the ER desk met me that she was gone. In the next week after the adjustments, I'd driven my sons to school and was on my way to work. There are some industrial sites at a cross street right before a spotlight, and it can get busy and bottled up. Also, there's a hill going down in the direction of where I was headed. I again felt a warm presence and felt her hand on my arm. Her voice said, "Vicky, look up." Far enough ahead of me was a tractor-trailer truck crossing over my lane into the side street. I'd been in deep thought about so much, but had plenty of time to slow down very preventively, not to have any problems with the truck. She has been with me many times since then, and it is always such a warm, loving feeling. In her life, she dismissed ghosts and paranormal things as if she didn't think it was real. I have no idea if she has ever been with any of my 4 sisters or my brother, but she has definitely been with me. Thanks for reading. When I was about 4 years old, I answered the front door. We had one of those bells that was a knob you would turn on the outside. There, in bright daylight, stood a woman dressed in all pale yellow, in a long dress and matching, colored big brimmed hat. This occurred in the 1950s, around 1959. I let her in. She asked for my mother. I told her I didn't know where she was. She was illuminated. I thought by the sunlight coming through the glass of the front windows and doorway. I was only about 4 years old. Not frightened by her, but rather I was fascinated and mesmerized. I followed her into our living room. She proceeded to sit on the antique Empire couch and kept asking where my mother was, and she seemed very concerned that I was left all by myself at a very young age. After what may have been an hour or so, she got up from the couch and said to me, "Tell your mother that Ada said it was very beautiful and don't be afraid." She then got up, walked to the front door with me following her, and left. When my mother came home, I told her about the lady in yellow named Ada and related her message. My mom almost fainted and fell down on the same spot where Ada sat. She asked me in a very unnerving voice, "Are you sure she said she was Ada?" To which I said yes. Then she said, "My cousin Ada just died a few days ago." At my age then, thankfully, I feared nothing. Ghosts were not in my brain tank, so to speak. Until about 7 years later, I was up in our attic. It was a very old house, looking for stuff to wear for Halloween, and came across the same dress Ada had worn when she showed up as a ghost many years before. It was a dress that had actually belonged to her from when she was young in the early 1900s. Also had a run-in when I was 19 years old. Old same house, with a sea captain. I was lying in my bed, daylight, and I was not asleep, just relaxing. Suddenly, I felt someone was there, next to me, and no one but me and my mom were home. My mom was downstairs watching TV. So, very reluctantly, I slowly looked to my left, and there, standing, was a tall man dressed in a blue uniform with brass buttons with anchors on them. He had no face, just like TV static for a face, but the rest of him was visible. He reached out a huge hand to me and said, "Don't be afraid. I only want to touch your blonde hair." It took me a while to not have a heart attack, until I found my voice. I screamed to my mom. She came running upstairs. I told her what happened, and she said, "You just had a bad dream." I explained to her I wasn't asleep. I knew what I saw, and I was very frightened. She then told me that my most male ancestors on her side of the family were sea captains, and some were lost at sea. She assured me that he didn't want to hurt me, but he almost killed me from fright. I've also had animal ghost visits, and those were of course sad, but that's a whole nother story. Didn't want to bore you. You may now go to sleep. Thanks for reading. I've decided after about a month or two of wandering around your site that I'll add my own story. I noticed your last update was in 2003 or so, therefore, I'm not expecting immediate posting of my tale. Keep in mind, this is the first time I've ever written the story out, so excuse me if I digress or repeat myself. In other stories that I've read, I've noticed people apologizing for extensive background information, so here's my apology/disclaimer. There's a serious pity me, I've had a hard life story involved that needs to be told before the actual ghost story can be understood. Feel free to skip over it, but don't expect to get the whole situation if you do. Oh, and may I add that I'm not completely looking for sympathy or anything. So that being said, here goes. When I was 14, I was living in a predominantly African American suburb in Illinois. My best friend and I seemed to be the only white teenagers around. Something started one night when someone called my friend's, let's call her Jen's, cell phone. The number showed up on Jen's caller ID as private number, and Jen answered, thinking it might be her parents calling from the restaurant they had gone to. But the other person on the other end started ranting about how Jen was a slutty person and a nasty whore. The caller proceeded to tell Jen that she should just kill herself and get it over with, adding that if Jen didn't commit suicide, the caller and her friends would hunt her down and slaughter her. Jen told the girl to grow up and hung up the phone. She was obviously and understandably shaken up, but she had the sense to star 69 to call. She wrote down the number and informed her parents of the incident when they returned. The next day, Jen's father, being the military man he is, called the number. No one picked up, so he and Jen headed to the police station. The police force in that town was also predominantly black, and when Jen stated that she thought the caller was black because of the way she spoke, the officer behind the desk gave her a dirty look and said he'd look into it and call her in the morning. She never heard from him. Then again, she never got another threatening phone call either. About a month later, Jen and I were walking back to our place from a convenience store about 9 o'clock at night when we heard something walking behind us. We turned around and there was this black girl following us. We didn't recognize her from anywhere, and yet she started screaming the most obscene things I've ever heard, directed at Jen. To this day, and I'm 20 now, I've never heard such awful things come out of a human being's mouth before. This girl, who looked to be about our age, told Jen, "I told you to just kill yourself. I warned you that I'd get you if you didn't." She then stabbed my best friend in the stomach and chest. I was frozen with fear and shock, but I finally jumped on the girl and started punching her with such fury and animal rage that she backed off and ran, but in the scuffle, she slit my arm pretty badly and took off. I started to chase her, intending to tackle her to the ground, not knowing if I wanted to hold her down until someone came to help or if I wanted to just kill her for hurting my best friend. But I quickly decided that Jen needed me, so I went to Jen, ripped my t-shirt off, wrapped it tightly over her wounds, and told her to hang on. I ran back to the store we had just left, in my bra, which made the most horrifying moment of my life also the most embarrassing, and begged to use the phone. I called the police and explained what had happened and where we were. Then I darted back to Jen, ignoring the blood dripping onto my jeans and the pain in my forearm. I sat there, with Jen's head in my lap, pressing the shirt against her injuries, telling her I loved her and everything would be okay, and that the police said they'd be there with the ambulance as soon as possible. It wasn't soon enough. Jen died in the ambulance. The stab wound to her chest punctured her left lung. She suffocated before even reaching the hospital. I didn't find out until the next morning. It was 2 summers later that I saw her. My family moved to New Jersey soon after the incident, thinking a change of scenery would help me forget. Wrong. Our new home was down the street from a conservation area, where I liked to go and relax on nice days. There was one specific spot that I liked. There was a neat little clearing where just enough sunlight came through the thick trees, and there was a fallen tree that I'd sit on to read or write or whatever. On the other side of the clearing though, there was a spot I wasn't too fond of. There were 6 saplings, taller than I, forming a triangle. I never had a positive vibe from that area. It just felt wrong, not like the rest of the clearing, where I felt peaceful and relaxed. if I walked through those trees, I'd have this overwhelming urge to burst out in tears and hurt something. I never knew why until one day. I was sitting on my tree, smoking a cigarette, and reading Shakespeare when that angry, depressing feeling came over me. The feeling I only got from that triangle of young trees. I ignored it and kept reading, but it grew and grew until I felt like I'd choke on it. So I looked up at the triangle and waited. For what? I had no idea. There was a little smoke coming up from the leaves on the ground, but I wrote that off as lit cigarettes someone had thrown. Then again, since I'd been there for quite a while and hadn't seen anyone around, how could someone have thrown a cigarette in there? So I shrugged it off and kept reading. Then I heard leaves rustling, and the feeling of deep depression intensified. There was no wind, the trees were not swaying, my hair wasn't blowing, but leaves were moving. I raised my head and saw only leaves being pressed into the ground, as if an invisible person were walking across them, and they were coming towards me. Needless to say, I booked it out of there and sprinted home. That night, I woke up unable to breathe, with a searing pain in my stomach. I turned the light on, and just as I did, I caught a glimpse of those familiar blue icy eyes I knew and loved. My best friend. After a few minutes, the stomach pain went away, and I caught my breath and turned the light only to see those eyes again and feel presence on my bed like someone sitting down. I felt like she was sitting there watching me. The corners turned up a little, and something cold touched my cheek. I realized then that the angry/depressed feeling I often got was flashing back to the emotions I had the night she was killed. Angry at the killer and myself, and so very depressed that the best friend I'd ever had was taken away from me. And the pains I had moments before were the same feeling she had when she was taking her last gasp of air. I suddenly felt overpoweringly tranquil. She was here, and she was not angry with me. "I miss you," I said, and went back to sleep. Nothing has happened since, and it's been 3 years. I think she's watching over me every day now, except I know it's her, not by a feeling of extreme sadness, but by the overwhelming urge to smile and make the most of my day. Thank you for reading. I know this was heavy-hearted, but I appreciate you sticking through to the end. Thank you so much. It happened when I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, but I remember what I saw vividly. My little sister and I were ready to go to bed. At that time period, we always slept on the couch together in the living room. Living in an old farmhouse that was heated by a wood stove, the upstairs got a bit cold to sleep in, and we didn't have the luxury of electric blankets back then, so therefore we slept downstairs in the living room. I remember my dad saying goodnight and turning off the light, and I closed my eyes. I opened them again a few seconds later because I hadn't heard my dad leave to go to bed yet. I was wondering why. I assumed that he would still be standing there, but when I opened my eyes, he wasn't there, and neither was my sister, who previously was awake. She was sound asleep. Maybe I had somehow fallen asleep without noticing, but I don't think so. In our living room, there was a door with glass that led to the closed-in porch, and the door was what I could see if I looked up while I was lying on the couch. That night, I looked up and saw a glowing form of a man sitting at the table on the porch. You couldn't really see anything other than his outline, and he didn't glow brightly, just sorta dimly, as if he was made out of shapeless glowing fog. As I saw him, he turned and looked straight at me. He had no face, just the same glowing fog. I was terrified and hid my face under the blankets. I kicked my sister awake. She wasn't very happy with me. Still not looking back up, I asked her if she saw it. She said she didn't, and that I should go back to sleep. I convinced her to get up and investigate, and she got up, looked around, and found nothing. Years later, I told the story to my sister, asking if she remembered it. She said yes, and then asked me if she had ever told me about the time when she had seen a ghost. I hadn't. She then told me that one night she woke up in the middle of the night and heard the TV flashing on and off. Thinking her parents were still awake, she walked into the living room. What she saw was the TV turning on and off by itself. There was no one in the room. She looked over to the couch to find the remote to turn it off, and that's when she saw it. A ghost sitting and floating over the couch. She said it felt like she had spent hours looking at it. As soon as it turned and looked at her, she felt panicked and quickly ran and went back to bed. When she looked at the time, a minute had not yet passed since she had got out of bed. She didn't tell anyone about what had happened until years later. When she told me this, I asked her what her ghost had looked like. She then described the exact same glowing ghost that I had seen. The creepy thing is that I had never told her what the ghost I had seen looked like, just that I had seen one. Our continued conversation revealed that many details of our stories matched up. Another glowing encounter. I haven't been around for a while. I've been so busy it's hard to get free time. But finally, I can share another experience that I had just a few nights ago. It's winter here and it's really getting cold out, especially at night. So I bundle up and sit in my car to stay warm whenever I go out for a smoke. This night was odd. I was the only one outside that I could see. It was late and dark out, and nothing but the streetlights to illuminate the parking lot. Everything was fine during my smoke. I finished it, turned off my car, and started walking back towards the dorm. I take a glance up at the smoke pit, up the small hill, and see no one out there. So I look back ahead for only a second. But in that second, I suddenly felt a presence, and I immediately looked up back at the smoke pit, and I see this hazy figure on top of one of the tables. It looked like someone wearing a hoodie and sitting cross-legged on the table, but he was completely see-through. I could see the road behind him and the grassy hills that led to the base housing area, and the lights from the streets were glowing right through him, yet they seemed dim in the haze of this figure. What freaked me out the most was that his eyes were very distinct, and they were glowing a very bright white. The figure just stared at me, and I stopped dead in my tracks staring at him. I don't know why, but I could not move at all. Finally, after what felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes, the figure began to slowly fade away until it was completely gone. I felt like I was released from some invisible chain, and I could move again, and I ran back to my dorm room and made sure everything was locked. I've been seeing strange things all my life, and I understand that this weird ability can cause spirits to be attached to me. Most of the time, I just ignore it, but sometimes there are those moments that I am petrified, and I can't even explain why. I will say this though, this is the first time I have ever seen a figure with glowing white eyes. I've seen red, blue, and a strange haze of purple, but never bright white. Has anyone else seen something like this before? Thank you for reading. Creepy story number 3. When I was 7 years old, my mother, my brother, and I lived in a small 3-bedroom house in a nondescript little town in west central Illinois. I'd been aware of the paranormal for quite some time, as we live in a house that in the 1800s has been something like an abortion center. A summer after my birthday, my grandmother bought me and my younger half-sister a glow-in-the-dark Muppet shirt that were too big for us, so instead we used them as nightshirts. I loved this shirt and wore it all the time. That fall, though, after the leaves had fallen off the trees, I remember because I looked out the window. I became scared from that shirt for life. I'd fallen asleep lying in my usual spot. I had a small bedroom with a bunk bed, and I slept on the bottom bunk, my head in line with the window, but on the far side of the bed, a twin-size mattress, that is. I remember waking up mentally, realizing that Bluey, my stuffed rabbit, had fallen off the bed. I had an attachment issue to him, so it was really a big deal. Still, I didn't open my eyes because I felt as though somebody was watching me. I remember through my eyelids, a bright green light in the same color as my shirt. I figured it was just my shirt, but I still wanted to make sure, of course. I pulled the covers over my head and opened my eyes. I hadn't looked at my shirt yet, but I remember the light was definitely coming from the other side of my blankets. I looked down and was shocked, only to realize my shirt was plain white. No Muppets, no glow in the dark, just a plain white t-shirt. Without removing the covers, I took the shirt off and checked all sides of it. There was still nothing there. I pulled the shirt back on, sat up, and yanked the covers down over my head so I could see. There, sitting at the end of my bed, was a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He had pale hair and dark eyes, and honestly looked a lot like myself. We stared at each other for a few minutes. There was a smug look about him as he stared at me in a rather cool way, and I looked at him with what I'm sure horror mixed with curiosity. Horror because I knew he wasn't human, and curiosity because on his impish little body was my Muppet's shirt pattern. My Muppets were glowing at me from his spectral body, and they seemed scary at that point. I tried screaming for my mom, but my throat was tight, almost like I was paralyzed or mute. I can only describe it by saying it was like I was going to cry, but never did. After what seemed like an eternity, the spirit boy crawled over to me, his hands making little indentations on the bed as his weight shifted forward, and he sat on his knees in front of me, between me and the window. He sat there for a minute, our noses maybe 3 inches apart, and then he smiled, or bared his teeth. His teeth, I remember, were normal, except that where he should have had canines, he had fangs. Fangs as in the kind big dogs have. Pointy, sharp, kind of curved, but not so much. I was still registering what his teeth were when he disappeared, just vanished. No faded away, no transition at all. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. I felt like screaming, but still couldn't speak. About 5 minutes after he left, the Muppets materialized. Yes, just slowly appeared, where they belonged on my shirt, on my body. I was too afraid to move, too afraid of what else might be in my room, and under my bed, to go to my mom and even grab Bluey. A few weeks later, my great-grandfather, Alan, died. I've seen him 4 times since then, each time preceding a major life-altering loss. I'd also like to point out that I've moved multiple times since then. I feel him a lot, but still haven't seen him, which I'm glad for, honestly. He never grew up, at least in appearance. The time he appeared to me before my boyfriend's car accident, though, he looked sad. I saw him in the mirror in my bedroom for a few seconds, looking as though he wanted to say something, but he disappeared before either of us could. Has anybody else ever experienced anything like this little boy? I don't think he's evil or good, but just there. I don't know. Had to share this though.
First and foremost, let me say that I have never been a believer in the supernatural. It's not that I don't think that there's more to life than what we can physically see. It's just that I've never really had a ghostly encounter, and I'm just like most ordinary people, going about my business, paying bills, trying to make ends meet, and so forth. That was until Hurricane Katrina. I'm a military policeman in the Air Force Reserves in Texas. We were activated in August of 2005 at the behest of our governor to help the battered state of Louisiana. Part of our job was to patrol the streets of New Orleans with food, water, and what little medication we had left to offer the citizens of New Orleans. We were also there to offer transportation to those who wished to leave, but were stuck without a means to travel. Contrary to what the then Mayor Nagin stated on TV and radio, we were not there to harass black people. We were volunteers who were trying to help fellow Americans. That being said, I remember one evening we were patrolling near the 9th Ward. Not a very nice place, even before the hurricane hit. My squad and I were walking in the middle of the street, yelling out that we were military police. We had food, water, and a way out if anyone needed assistance. I could see every house had been boarded up to keep the looters out, and many people spray-painted slogans on front and sides of their homes. "You loot, I shoot," and "You loot, you die" were the ones that stuck out the most in my mind. Slowly, some people did emerge from their homes and asked for water, food, and medicine. We gave them whatever we had and asked them if they needed to be evacuated. Many refused to leave their homes for fear of losing what little they had left. Anyway, I noticed that all the houses on this particular block had been boarded up. It was a typical southern plantation-style home, which looked like it had been built around the time of the Civil War. A small figure of a little girl caught my eye as I looked up at the second floor. I smiled and waved at her, mainly to let her know that I was there to help and that she had nothing to fear. She seemed to smile and wave back from what I could tell. I called out to her to get her mommy or daddy, but she just stood there staring at me. It was then that a kind of cold shiver ran up my spine. I really couldn't understand why. It was my cop sense kicking in. 2 tours in Iraq and over 20 years as a sheriff deputy had developed this. So when it went off, I paid attention. Just then, an elderly man on a bike rode up on us asking if we could help evacuate his family of 7 out of New Orleans. I told him we'd be happy to help him out and asked him if he knew anything about the little girl and her family living in the old plantation home. He looked at me kind of puzzled and asked, "What girl?" I turned around and pointed to the second floor window, but she was gone. I told him that I had just seen a little girl at the window and she waved to me. His eyes widened a little and he just smiled and said, "So, you've seen her too?" He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, there ain't nobody living in that house for over 100 years." I started to protest, but he just shook his head, laughed, and walked away. As he was leaving, I could have sworn I heard him say, "Some things about New Orleans are better left unsaid." I spent the first 18 years of my life living in a small Kansas town. Although there was little reason to stay, it was a great place to grow up, and I have many fond memories of exploring the nearby woods and rivers. A lot of strange things happened in and around that town, but I will only tell of one for now. This short story is about the Burns Ranch. The Burns Ranch was located about 5 miles west of town, situated at the base of a gently sloping hill, literally out in the middle of nowhere. A curving gravel road was the only way to get there, and beyond the house, this same road soon petered out into dirty ruts that faded into miles and miles of unused pasture land. The house itself was a 2-story Victorian that had to have been built in the early 1900s. It was old, but wonderfully remodeled and a beauty to behold. A smaller, more modern guest house stood behind it, and an ancient barn nearby completed things. All of this had been in the Burns family for generations, handed down from one son to the other until finally Richard Burns inherited it. At the time of this story, Mr. and Mrs. Burns had a newborn baby girl and a son who was about 4 years younger than me. I was a family friend, and while in my high school years, would house sit while they were all away on business trips or vacations. This was a great gig for any teenager, and I always jumped at the chance to get away from it all and spend some time alone out there. One summer, they asked me to stay at their place for a few weeks. The first week I was to be alone as usual, but the second week, their son Robert was going to be there. Although not much younger than me, they for some reason wanted me to keep an eye on him. We got along well enough, so this was all fine with me. I left for the ranch one late afternoon, just as the shadows of the day were starting to bend longer towards the east. Weaving through the curves of the road and over old, low water bridges, I finally crested a hill, made my way down to the last of the bridges, passed through a small forest, and then came out into the wide, open spaces of prairie land. About 100 yards further down the road was the house. No matter how many times I went out to the ranch, I could never fully get over the creepy feeling that would wash over me the minute the house came into view. It always seemed foreboding and spooky. The place looked haunted. One corner of the house formed a rotunda in which Robert's room was located on the second floor. As I neared the house, I could see someone standing in the shadows of his room, holding the curtain back and watching me arrive. Pulling into the driveway, I saw the curtain fall back into place, swinging slightly. It seemed that someone was home, and I wouldn't be alone that first week after all. The driveway led around the house to the back door, which everyone used when entering or exiting the house. The only time I ever saw the front door used was after dinner, when we would go out to sit on the porch and watch the sunset. I locked up the car, went through the gate of the fenced-in yard, and knocked on the door, waiting for whoever was inside to answer. When no one did, I went across the yard, past the 3-foot statue of the Virgin Mary, and toward what amounted to a cement room that had been built into the side of the hill. It was some sort of storm shelter, and near the door, I found the keys to the house, which were always hidden there behind an old painting. As I let myself into the foyer and sat my bags on a bench, I kept calling out to let my presence be known. Dead silence was my only welcome. On the right side of the entranceway were the stairs that led up to the bedrooms. Under the stairs and next to the bench upon which my bag sat was the door that led to the basement. Beyond the door and in front of me was the dining room, the kitchen being to its left. To the right of the dining room were the rest of the downstairs, a few sitting rooms, the library, and an entertainment room. Sure, I saw someone at the window. I began a search of the house, starting with the first floor before working my way upstairs. The stairs ascended to an L-shaped hall. Just to the left were the master bedroom and bath. To the right and down the hall, past another bathroom, were the baby room and a spiral staircase that led to one of the sitting rooms below. The guest room I used as well as Robert's bedroom was around the corner at the end of the L. I searched these rooms, then went down to the basement, which had been renovated into a modern living room with a complete bar. I found nothing. Perplexed, but kinda used to how weird the house could be, I went back upstairs to unpack and start to enjoy my stay. I set up my guitar and amp in the entertainment room, where I planned on creating rock songs I was sure millions would jam to in years to come. The fridge was stacked, so that was no problem, and I had brought along a ton of movies to watch on the VCR in the basement. It seemed the only thing I had to worry about was the occasional phone call and feeding the dog, which was in a pen out near the old cement shelter. No problem as far as I was concerned. I had been house-sitting here many times before, so knew how eerie things would feel when evening came. Like I said, it just had that look of a haunted house. Not much happened that first night, and the next day I got up, fed and watered the dog, then watched a few movies before taking a short walk around the property. That evening the phone rang, and it was Mr. Burns. He wanted to know how much it rained the night before. I knew he was out of state, so told him it didn't rain at all, but he insisted I check his rain counter, a measuring device that he had attached to a post near his mailbox. I went out and sure enough, although it had been completely dry the last few days, there was about 1/4 inches of water at the bottom of the thing. I went back to the phone, where he was waiting on the other line, and told him. He didn't seem surprised and said it would probably rain that night. He told me to take care, make sure to keep the doors locked, and to not let anyone in when evening came. I liked Mr. Burns, and he was a decent guy, but sometimes he talked like that, making little sense at all. So I agreed to do as he said and hung up the phone. About 3 hours later, evening crept up on the ranch, and with it came the first storm of the summer. This wasn't just a small shower. This was a torrent. It came down heavy for about 30 minutes, then calmed to a steady downpour. Suddenly, the phone started ringing. I would answer, but no one would be on the other end of the line. It rang like that all night, about 3 times an hour, and each time I picked up the receiver, I would be greeted with silence. No voice, no signals, nothing. Just silence. As the rain came down, I looked out the window, down toward the road that led back to town. I saw a flicker of light through the nearby forest and went to stand on the front porch to get a better look. Sure enough, there was someone down there. It seemed a vehicle had just stopped inside the forest at the low water bridge. Whoever it was had most likely been coming out to the ranch, so to make sure there was no trouble, I reluctantly slid on my bad weather clothes, went out to the shelter where I hung up the key, then made my way through the rain and mud down the road toward the light. The wind was howling and the rain pouring down in sheets, but I could still see the light shining whenever I raised my head to see where I was going. I finally got to the curve that led into the woods and towards the low water bridge, but when I made the turn, there was nothing there. By now, I was really freaked out. The bridge was flooded over, and there were no tire marks on either side of it. I could clearly see the other side of the bridge, and no one had been down it since well before the rain started. Probably not since I came down the day before. I checked around a few more minutes just to make sure no one happened to be there needing help, and then made my way back to the ranch. The phone was ringing again as I entered, but I didn't bother picking it up this time. Let it ring. I had wet clothes to get out of and weird lights to think about. I was warming up in the kitchen a few hours later when I heard a car horn go off. A steady drizzle was coming down now, and looking out the window again, I noticed the lights near the bridge were back, this time dancing around through the trees before turning up the road and coming toward the house. It was a car, and every few seconds the driver would toot the horn a few times. I got on my clothes, wrapped a still damp coat around me, and went out the back door, this time armed with a rifle. I could see nothing past the light of the porch, so went out into the storm, carrying the rifle and a small flashlight. I went towards the barn and down the soggy driveway. The horn was still honking, but I could no longer see the road due to tall brush in the fields, so the car was invisible to me, but getting louder and louder by the moment. Everything suddenly seemed to build up. The car horn got louder. I could now see the glare of the lights growing through the brush. I found myself getting tense, pointing the now cocked rifle in the general direction of whoever was coming down that road. The horn rang out one more time. The light shined just a little brighter. I finally got to the end of the drive and went out onto the road. There was nothing there to greet me, Just a dark, wet, stormy night, and a muddy road that led to a very flooded bridge. Even the rain seemed to have eased up a bit. After a few minutes of trying to figure this all out, I gave up, covering the rifle so as to keep the water off of it. I trudged back toward the house for the last time that night, deciding it was safer inside than out there in the open. Nothing much happened for the rest of the evening until about 4 a.m., when I was awakened by someone pounding on the front door. This was odd. Everyone always used the back door. Nonetheless, I got out of bed, put my clothes on, and went downstairs to find out what was going on. My body ached from being out in the storm the night before. I tried to hurry down the stairs and through the house as fast as possible, listening as the banging became more and more persistent. I had no idea that no one was going to be waiting for me on the porch when I opened the door, and I was right. Unable to sleep, I looked around a bit, then brewed a large, strong pot of coffee and sat reading until the sun poked over the horizon. The day was bright, hot, and humid, and after a short nap, I decided to take a walk around the property. I hung the keys back inside the shelter so as not to lose them, and as I did, I got a strong urge to go into the little room and explore a bit. I have no idea why I would suddenly want to do this, since there was really nothing in there, and to be honest, it was not a place I wished to be in. Still, it took a little more effort to walk away from the shelter. Something told me not to enter all the way, so I just stuck my hand in, quickly placed the keys beside the painting, and then I shut the heavy door. I took a long walk. Before going back to the low water bridge, I shut the barn door, which had come open during the previous evening's storm, then made my way to the top of the hill behind the house. From here, I got a great view of everything for miles and miles. I sat up there for some time, then went to the river. The bridge was still flooded out, but not as bad as before. There were no tire marks and no evidence whatsoever of anyone being there before except for what tracks I made. I still had no idea as to what had happened the night before. I would have thought it was all a prank, but the storm was a bad one, and beside, the bridge had been out. I went back to the ranch, and the first thing I noticed was that the barn door was open again. Already on edge, I peered inside, then closed the door, placed a large rock in front of it. Later that afternoon, while working out a few songs on my guitar, I kept getting a very strong feeling of someone standing right behind me. No matter where I would sit, the feeling was always there. Growing tired of it, I stopped what I was doing and said out loud, "Stop it! I'm trying to do something here." No sooner had I said this than the feeling stopped. It came back whenever I would start to practice my music, but went away when I told it to. The next day, I was upstairs going through some things when I heard, very loudly, someone downstairs yell out, "Hey!" It startled me at first, but then I thought it might be the family coming home early, so I put up what I was doing and went down to find an empty house. The rest of my time there alone was uneventful, with the exception of a lot of weird feelings. The library for some reason spooked me, as did the shelter, and I refused to use the spiral staircase located next to the baby room. I was somewhat nervous the whole time and took many long walks. Once while sitting at the top of the hill, I saw a car coming towards the ranch. It passed through the forest and made it over the bridge. I was actually a little relieved. Robert had finally showed up. Robert's grandmother had brought him back from a summer camp he had attended, and after we finally said our goodbyes, I sat on the porch with him listening to the various stories he had to tell and looking through the photos he'd brought back. I was reluctant to mention my own tales, but it didn't matter. Robert had grown up in that house. He knew something weird had happened to me while I was home alone there. We spent the next few days enjoying the good weather. We hiked, explored the valleys and forests along the road, and went on drives that took us to places we'd never been to before. One night, just as the sun was setting, Robert finally asked me how my stay had been. I didn't hesitate in telling him some of the odd things that had happened, and he reaffirmed some of them with his own stories. It seems he too was drawn toward the cement shelter where the keys were hidden. The only difference was that he had gone inside, the heavy door slamming shut, locking him in. It was some time before he was able to push the thing open and get out. He said that the Virgin Mary statue had been removed, so it was facing the doorway, as if watching his struggle. He was as confused as I concerning the lights at the bridge and the mystery car, but he did mention seeing a lady come down the spiral staircase I was so afraid of. She came down, glared at him for a moment, and then walked back up. Robert never found out who she was, but felt she was not nice. He also told me of dreams he had about the library. They were vivid and scary and involved a closet. He had just recently discovered that a relative had been born in that room years ago and had died there as well. Above each bedroom door was a small window, and Robert said one early morning he woke up seeing the shadow of someone come down the hall and stand in front of his slightly open door. The person stood there for some time before Robert called out, thinking it was his father. When he got no reply, Robert screamed for his parents, and as they turned the corner in the hall, the shadow disappeared. That explained why I always felt watched whenever I tried to sleep in the guest room across the hall. As for Robert's room, I only went in there to get a CD now and then. I never felt comfortable in there ever since I saw someone looking out the window at me as I came up to the house that first day. Towards the end of my stay, Robert and I settled down one evening in the basement. We had movies to watch and were set for the night. There was a small bathroom between the foyer and the kitchen, and in it was an old-fashioned toilet that had a string you pulled when you wanted to flush it. The thing was loud, and as we sat downstairs watching our second movie, we could hear it flushing. We inspected it before finally turning off the water and returning to our movies. Around 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, we were in that zombie state just before sleep actually comes. Suddenly, we heard the back door slam shut. Wide awake now, we grabbed a few rifles that we had brought down to the basement with us and listened. From right above us, we heard the unmistakable sound of boots shuffling across the foyer floor. They slowly came towards the basement door and stopped. Then we heard the door creak open. I admit, I finally came to understand the term shaking like a leaf, but Robert wasn't much braver. We were too scared to even try and pretend to be cool. For a moment there was nothing, and then whoever was above us came walking down the stairs. We could hear someone brush against the coats that hung on pegs along the wall. We could hear the firm, deliberate sound of boots making contact with the warped boards that were the steps. The stairway going down into the basement was hidden behind a wall, so that anyone who came down could not be seen until they reached the bottom. The third stair from the bottom always made a horrible squeaking noise, and when we heard that, we raised our rifles and waited and waited. Finally, when no one came into view, I told whoever was there we were armed and to leave. There was no sound at all. Eventually we gained a little courage and slowly peeked around the wall and up the stairway. No one was there. The door was shut. I was beyond scared at this point, and after going throughout the house and checking the doors and windows, we spent the rest of the night in the dining room talking about what had just happened. To this day, I am unsure what to think. We heard, without a doubt, the back door open and slam shut. But when we checked it, the key was still in the lock and the door was still bolted from the inside. Robert left the next day to go spend a few days at a friend's home. He wasn't surprised when I told him I was asking another friend of mine to come out and stay with me on my final night there. That night was quiet, except for the usual strange feelings. Even my friend mentioned it and left early the next morning. Rather than spend another day there alone waiting for Mr. and Mrs. Burns to return, I wrote a note telling them I had to leave early to run a few errands, placing it on the kitchen table. I packed up all my things, made sure the house was cleaned up, and then locked the door. A sudden sense of urgency overcame me as I walked to the shelter to put up the extra key. I came close to just tossing it into the room in my struggle to hurry, but managed somehow to put it back in its proper place on the hook. As I walked to the car, I noticed the barn door was open again, and although I tried to ignore it, I ended up going over and shutting it. The big rock I had put in front of it earlier was gone. No one ever said anything about me leaving earlier or asked how my stay was. Miss Burns would often laugh at the idea that her house could ever be haunted, but sometimes I think that laughter was a little forced. As for Mr. Burns, when I asked him how he knew it would rain in the evening, I checked the level of water in his gauge. He looked at me puzzled and swore he never even called me during that trip. I still don't know what to make of that place. Like I said, lots of strange things happened in and around the small town I grew up in, and that was just one of them.
My name is Dino. I'm 32 years old, married, and work as a scaffolder for a small company in Cairns for North Queensland, Australia. I moved here from a small country town at the top of Victoria called Melindra roughly 8 years ago, with then my girlfriend of 3 years. I have always been very skeptical about ghosts and thought it was just a market to make money, until that day. It was the middle of summer, very hot and humid. Me and Angela, my girlfriend, jumped into my work vehicle and was going to get home and get some lunch, and she wanted to go to Job Hi-Fi to grab some CDs. With me driving and her in the front passenger seat, we were driving down the main road. It is called Captain Cook Highway. When to the left of us, on the side of the road, was a woman with dark hair and a beautiful white wedding dress. She had a very scared and troubled look on her face, and she was lifting up the bottom of her dress so it would not touch the dirty road. It looked like she had no shoes on, and it looked also as if she had her feet burnt to a crisp. Once I had driven past her, my girlfriend said, "Did you even see the woman in the wedding dress?" I replied, "Yes, let's go back and see if she is okay," as she looked really upset. So I turned around and headed back. It must have been no more than 40 seconds before we were back to where we spotted her, and she was completely gone. Now this is a highway, and there were no houses or people around, and there was only horse paddocks and a slight steep cliff, so there is nowhere to go or even hide. Me and my girlfriend were in complete shock and could not believe what we just saw. I had never told anybody this until recently, when my mate Ryan came over. We were watching Netflix, some paranormal show was on, and I felt comfortable enough to tell him. I told him, "Hey, I think me and my ex-girlfriend may have seen a ghost." He said, "Oh yeah? Where about?" And I explained that between the Carnivica roundabout and the Yorkies roundabout on the Captain Cook Highway. He looked straight at me and said it wasn't a woman in a wedding dress, was it? My skin started crawling. I stammered yes. He said he saw the same thing near Lake Placid that is roughly a couple of kilometers from where I saw her. He said he was getting dropped home late one night from a party, and he saw her walking on the side of the road. Thank you for reading my story. Back in the early 1980s, my now ex-husband, we'll call him Ed, my then 3-year-old son, and I moved into our first house. Ed started out as a one-room schoolhouse. I discovered proof with the removal of layers of wallpaper, revealed old state chalkboards, and had grown into a monstrously large farmhouse-type structure due to folks adding on over the years. The place had a lot of quirks. For instance, the main floor had 2 full bathrooms, a very large country-type kitchen, and a smaller galley-type kitchen in what one time served as a mother-in-law apartment. This is also where the second bathroom was. Inside that apartment was also a Murphy ironing board that folded up into the wall. What I found very odd was at some point, someone had removed the interior doors that would have shut the two units off from each other. As a result, you could literally do laps around the ground floor. The front door led into a nice-sized living room. From there, you could see the staircase that led up to the two bedrooms upstairs. Another quirk, the upstairs rooms were not separated by a hallway of any sort. The top stairs split into two triangle stairs, one on the left, one on the right, and these faced the bedroom doors. I won't make you suffer through a lengthy description of the place. However, I thought these were points of interest that may aid with understanding the events that would take place here. Our first night in the place, I distinctly heard someone rummaging through the moving boxes downstairs. I sat up in bed and listened, deciphering normal house sounds from those that seemed like someone was moving around. I looked over at my sleeping husband and slid out from under the covers and cautiously crossed over into my son's room. I lifted his sleeping form and returned with him to my room, depositing him on my bed. Someone downstairs coughed. I shook Ed awake. "Someone's downstairs," I hissed. "Go check it out." After a few groggy swears, he informed me that I could check it out for myself. Something downstairs toppled over. I about wet myself. If we had an upstairs phone, we would in later years, and this was pre-cell phone days, I would have stayed put and called the cops. As it was, I gripped my ball bat and made my way down the stairs, flipping on the lights as I went. I didn't want to surprise whomever had broken in, and I really hoped they'd just run away. I could see into the living room. Boxes were strewn about, giving voice that someone had been going through them. I made my way through the entire lower floor, leaving lights burning in my wake as I checked every nook and cranny while straining my ears. While I didn't wish to confront whomever it was, I didn't want them surprising me either. On my way, I double-checked the doors and windows to be sure they were shut and locked tight. Finally, there was only one room left, the bathroom in the apartment. I pushed the door open hard, and in the dimness, saw someone staring back at me. As I reached for the light switch, I saw them move towards me. I bellowed loudly, swinging the bat with all my might. There was a tremendous crash of breaking glass as shards went flying in all directions. I fumbled for the switch again, and as it came on, realized that I had slanged a mirror that Ed had perched on the toilet tank. I wish he had told me. I fetched the broom and dustpan, feeling very foolish, and had just swept the bulk into a pile when there was a very loud banging at the front door. Neighbors hearing my scream had called the cops. Just try explaining that your own reflection had scared you that badly. At least they didn't laugh in front of me, but they grew very somber, learning that Ed, at 6'4", had stayed upstairs during the entire time and had only come down when their knock summoned us. I still recall them looking down at me, over at him, and back again with something that seemed to be a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "So you," one pointed at me, "came down to investigate, and you," he looked at Ed, "stayed upstairs?" Then things got weird. Cop A decided to see where this mirror was and check out the house to be sure it was secure, taking me in tow. Cop B stayed with Ed. I learned later that they had their own little chat, which left Ed feeling somewhat badly. As we approached the bathroom, I said, "Be careful, that glass went everywhere." But there was no glass to be seen, not a shard. The mirror sat on the toilet tank. Seeing it in the light, I realized I had never seen this mirror before, but I knew I had broken it. I had heard the glass smash. The broom and dustpan still sat in the door where I had left them. Weird. Very, very weird. After the cops left, I asked Ed where the mirror had come from. He said he'd found it in the basement. He went back to bed, and I went back to check the mirror out better. It was a rectangular in shape. The glass itself, a bit wavy looking, with a few light spots and tiny clear areas. Its framing was very ornate, tiny, interwoven vines interspersed with leaves and flowers. It was obviously an antique. Exactly how old, I wasn't sure, but guessed early to mid-1800s. I wanted to examine it, look for a manufacturer's mark, or possibly a date, but something about it made me feel strange. I reasoned that given the whole weirdness that had happened, the hour, and the move, perhaps it would have been wiser to wait for the light of day. I closed the door and went back up to bed, but not before saying a prayer of protection and adding that anything unkind was not welcomed in my home. The next day was very anticlimactic, at least in the weird department. Ed's family had swooped in on us to help. If you ask me, it was more of a way for his mother to dictate the way she thought we should decorate, complete with paint chips she thought would be just the colors we should use. And wouldn't that chair look better over there, I advise. She expressed an interest in the mirror when she saw it. The woman absolutely gushed over it, and before I could say one word more, Ed gifted it to her. I never saw it again, and oddly, whenever I'd bring it up, the subject would be changed. This morning, I woke up at about 3 a.m. I couldn't sleep for whatever reason. I turned and tossed until it started to look like it was starting to get daylight outside. Still dark, but not black outside. I was just laying in bed with my eyes closed, but I was awake. I opened my eyes to see my boyfriend sitting on the floor next to our bed, or so I thought. It didn't scare me at first because I thought it was actually him. I looked at him very inquisitively, but couldn't speak. He looked at me back like a confused dog or something, with his head all sideways. For some reason, the way he moved frightened me. I found myself leaping backwards to the other side of my bed, where I felt my boyfriend lay asleep. I thought to myself, is this real? I covered my eyes with my blanket because I was so scared. I thought it was because my eyes were adjusting. When I pulled the blanket back down and looked again, he hadn't moved, only reached towards me. I just lay there stiff as a board. I was too afraid to move or even speak. He sat there in the same position for what seemed like a very long time to me. The only thing that wasn't his were his eyes. They were black and white. He then laid down on the floor and was gone. When I felt like it wasn't coming back, I reached over to the light by our bed and flipped it on and just sat at the edge of our bed and wondered what just had happened to me. I'm afraid that it will keep happening. This has never happened to me before until last night. Someone please help me understand. What could this have been? What did it want? Someone was telling me that it was a bad thing, that other spirits like demonic things can form to look like loved ones. Is this true?
My husband and I moved into this small upstairs 2-bedroom apartment shortly after we were married. It was a beautiful old Victorian house, and the owner, a widow, lived downstairs in the rest of the house. We only lived there for about 1 to 2 months. A few weeks after we had moved in, I woke one night and was completely petrified. I mean, I was absolutely terrified. My heart was in my throat, pounding like it would jump out of my chest. Of what? I don't know. I can only describe it as an overwhelming feeling of evil. I saw nothing. I woke my husband up and told him we had to leave the house right now. He looked at me like I was crazy, of course. It was around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He must have saw the urgency and seriousness on my face, because I wouldn't even talk about what I was feeling. I just held on to him and insisted that we leave and drive somewhere, anywhere, before I said a thing, which we did. I then explained to him what had happened. He believed my feelings were sincere, but I had no details, just an overwhelming feeling of evil. Well, we moved out shortly after that, but I wasn't crazy. Almost 3 to 4 years later, still living in the same town, a girl came to work at the company that I worked for. She was the daughter of the widow who had lived downstairs of that creepy apartment. Oh, what a small world. We chatted along nicely. Then I told her what had happened that night, and wasn't it insane? She looked at me. Her face went pale, and she swallowed hard. "What month did you say that happened?" she asked me. "June." "Why?" She then proceeded to tell me about her brother. Her brother had committed suicide many years earlier in the bedroom that we slept in. It was over a girl. He had shot himself with a rifle, and it had been a June night. It still gives me the creeps when I think about it. Thanks for reading. I'm only writing now that I've moved into a new house. I've lived in 2 houses where I've had things happening. The first house I lived, things would disappear. As soon as you put it down, you would turn around and it wouldn't be there. I would be home late at night by myself, and the phone would keep ringing. When I went to answer it, no one would be there. After about a half an hour, I would usually unplug the phone. Well, one time when I did this, it still continued to ring all night long. Only once did I have the nerve to pick it up. Dead silence. The other house I had lived in, the most recent, I had a lot of things going on there. When I first moved in, I was doing some stuff around the house and decided to put some shelves into a closet that is in a bedroom in the basement. While I was hammering, I could hear someone or something knocking on the wall. This wouldn't have been so bad if I knew there could be someone on the other side, but being down in the basement, I knew it was on foundation, and after that, a lot of dirt. It just kept going knock, 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 always in 3s. Needless to say, I ran out of there. When I went back down the next day, it had luckily stopped and never happened again. Most of the things that ever happened in the house were usually in that room, and I unfortunately was the only one who ever had any problems. I would go down into the room, which eventually became my bedroom. It would smell cigarette smoke, as though someone had just been in there, smoking. No one in my house smokes. I could have put it off as one of the kids sneaking one, except it happened a few times when I was home alone. I would get woken up in the middle of the night by someone shaking the bed, or picking up a corner of the bed and letting it drop. One night, it felt as though someone was under the mattress and sticking their finger up, pushing the bed up. The worst stuff, though, started happening when the landlord was considering moving back into the house. I would wake up and feel terrified. It is hard to describe just how scared I was, but I've never felt more scared in my entire life. I wouldn't be able to move, only my eyes, and I would never see anything around me, just the normal shapes that were around the room. The worst night though that happened was on the night we were supposed to have left. I woke up to a growling noise and what felt like an arm being pushed down across my neck. I've since found out that the landlord's wife had passed away in the house, though I don't know what the basement room had to do with it. That was added on after she had died. I'm lucky enough to have gotten moved out without any more things happening, and I'm praying that the new house is entity free. Thanks for listening. I hesitate calling this a ghost story because I don't know what it was. It could have happened by normal means, but they would have been odd circumstances. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was walking down Harbor Boulevard in Costa Mesa, California. Harbor is long, and it's one of the streets that borders Disneyland. The section I was walking along was almost exclusively commercial. I passed a woman with a bruised face and a Universal Studios baseball cap with a logo in shiny silver letters, walking the other way. A few blocks later, I passed her again, going the other way. I think I may have smiled at her this time. A few blocks later, I passed her a third time, still walking the other way. I should point out that I was just walking. I never stopped to look into a store or restaurant. I was maintaining a steady pace. While I am no race walker, I have about an average walking speed. I'm not extraordinarily slow. After the third time I turned around, I don't want to exaggerate. I didn't whirl around by any means. I probably kept walking about another 10 steps saying to myself, this is kind of weird, and maybe stop for a brief moment to think about this. When I turned around, she was gone. There was a Polo Loco restaurant right there. I was in there and saw no sign of her. I went and looked down the nearest cross street. Again, no sign of her. As I say, I don't claim this a ghost story. I just claim this a weird event that happened to me, which is possible to explain through natural causes, but would be an odd circumstance. Yes, she could have gotten a ride, or had driven, but in that case, why would I have passed her on the sidewalk each time? Wouldn't she have driven or gotten a ride exactly where she was going, rather than half a block farther? If you have any light you could shed upon this, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Over the past 50 years or so, many members of my family have had interesting ghostly experiences. None of them have been particularly frightening, though. Here are a couple of those experiences. And these take place in Vancouver, British Columbia area. About 15 years ago, my grandmother was chopping cabbage up for supper one evening and accidentally cut her finger with a knife. As she was running her finger under the cold water tap, she distinctly heard a voice saying, "I've told you to be careful of knives, Kitty." The voice was that of her Aunt Neil, who had died 40 years previously. She was always scolding my grandmother for something or the other. Another experience happened to my aunt. 20 years ago, she and her family moved into a gorgeous 4-bedroom house in a wonderful area. The house itself was about 2 years old. After a while, she would find things missing. She put a brand new packet of knitting needles on the kitchen shelf, and when she'd go to get them, they'd be gone. But anything else on the shelf was then on the floor. Her daughter was at school, and her infant son was way too young to climb up there. The knitting needles turned up in the bath of all places. It was this moment then, when she thought there was a spirit in the house. She was even more convinced when she heard singing up in her daughter's room. She went up there and found no one. That night, my cousin refused to sleep in her room. A little while after that, Auntie went upstairs to check on the baby. As she looked in the cot where Andy was fast asleep, she swore she saw a woman's hand gently stroking his cheek. She calmly told the ghost, "He's asleep. Please don't wake him up." The ghost left. The ghost also likes to crash my aunt's parties. If guests were over, she'd come downstairs and join in. The only people who knew she was there were my aunt and my grandmother. I had only one experience with a ghost. I was babysitting one evening and was watching TV in the family room. All of a sudden, the dog perked up and started wagging its tail. I knew it was her. I said, "Come in and sit down," and continued to watch the TV. There were several other things that happened, but fortunately, the spirit was friendly and harmless. When my aunt moved out, she found out that the property where her house stood was once owned by the native Indians of the area and sold to the government in the early 1980s. My aunt thought that her ghost had darkish skin. Funny thing is that my uncle never saw or heard the ghost at all. There are many more stories to tell, but they'll come later. About 2 weeks ago, we were in bed watching TV. It was around 9:30 to 10 when we heard footsteps, kind of like our kids had gotten out of bed. Well, I got up and checked the kids, but they were still in bed sleeping. I went back to bed. About 5 minutes later, it happened again. This time, it sounded like it was running downstairs. My husband grabbed his gun. I went in the kids' room, and they were still sleeping. Vince said everything was locked up, so no one was in our house. We couldn't explain what happened, so we went to sleep. 5:45 in the morning, my daughter, who was 7, came in mumbling to me until I told her to calm down. She said it felt like someone was at the end of her bed and pushed her mattress, and in doing so, she heard her springs go up, like someone was on the bed with her. She was looking for her cat, which was asleep in her room. Now, we've been in our house almost 4 years now. Our house is a brand new home of about 5 years old. I started thinking about something that has happened in our house that I mentioned to my husband. I told him, remember a couple of times we had been gone all day, and when we came home, I smelled a man's cologne, very strong in some places. I also told him it wasn't his cologne. So here I was thinking that someone had been in our house. Yesterday, September 22nd, 1999, I was home by myself, watching TV downstairs. It was about 11:30 a.m., and I could have sworn my son, who is 6, was home in his room walking around, but he was at school. No one but myself was home. I went upstairs. Nothing was there. Today, September 23rd, 1999, I got home around 10:30 a.m., went upstairs, and there was a smell. I'm sorry I can't describe the smell, but all I can say is it doesn't smell good. Now, this smell tipped me off today because we had the smell prior from today. The strange thing about it is, only happens once in a while, and it usually smells strong in the hallway in my daughter's room upstairs. You would think a pungent smell like that would smell up the other rooms, but it never does. Every time I try to find where the smell comes from, there's never a pinpoint spot. Does anyone have any comments that they can help us with? How can we actually tell if we have some kind of paranormal activity going on in here? What we have experienced right now seems strange and definitely unnormal. Thank you. I actually have 2 stories, and I'm not sure I would call them ghost stories or not. Perhaps they are angels, but nonetheless, they happened and are not necessarily related. When I was in high school, I was madly in love with a guy 2 years older than me. I was a senior, and he was graduated and in the Air Force. He was my first love. Shortly before my high school graduation, I had made tentative plans to visit him at his base in Mississippi. I called him with my plan. He was less than thrilled. It was during this call that I found out he was seeing another girl, and we broke up. I was utterly devastated. I kept the pain to myself mostly. Nobody really knew how terribly it affected me. I was beside with myself with my heart. A couple of days after we broke up, I was in my bedroom upstairs. I heard my mother call my name from the bottom of the steps, and she sounded very strange. She said, "Come down here. You got some flowers delivered to you." I went to the kitchen, and my mother looked utterly baffled. I was convinced they were from Dan, and he wanted me back. The bouquet was huge and beautiful, with roses and exotic flowers and greens. It was obviously a very expensive arrangement. I opened the card and it said, "What the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the master calls a butterfly. Signed Anonymous." I asked everyone I knew if they sent the flowers. Nobody owned up to it. Nobody. My mom tried to call the florist. The florist said that the only thing they knew is that it came in FTD, which meant that it wasn't local. To this day, more than 15 years later, I still don't know who sent those flowers, but I somehow like to believe that they were a gift from an angel. The second story happened this past year. Both of my parents died this past year, both unexpectedly and very young. My mom died of a burst aneurysm in her heart, and my father died of complications of a heart bypass surgery. She was 59, and my father was 62. After my mom died, strange things began to happen. The first thing was the night of the first funeral home visitation. I was at that time at home, writing a letter to my mother to be placed in her casket to be buried with her. My sister and father were at my parents' house getting dressed when my sister, who was ironing in the basement, heard an extremely loud crash come from upstairs in the kitchen. It made her jump. She said she had been thinking about Mom. My dad, at the time of the large crash, was standing in the bedroom trying to decide what suit to wear. He said that he was thinking, no, I shouldn't wear that suit. Yvonne, my mom, wouldn't like that. My dad and my sister went into the kitchen. Above the kitchen sink was a window that my mom had filled with crystals and stained glass pretties that were suction cupped to the window. My mom's favorite was of a blue stained glass oval of an angel praying. It was that glass ornament that had fallen into the sink and made the crash. Those ornaments had been there for years and never fell into the sink, but they did this day. 2 days later, I had to attend a doctor's appointment. My mother and dad were leaving to meet the funeral director, and I was leaving for the doctor. I stopped and said, shoot, I don't have money for the copay, and I'm running late. I don't have time to stop at the bank. My sister gave me the money for it. On the way to the appointment, I realized that, shoot, I was meeting a friend for lunch, and I still don't have any money. I thought to look in the console of my car, but I knew there would be no money there. I never have money in my car. I looked anyway, but when I opened the lid, there sat a $5 bill. Odd, but I was so glad to see it. I didn't think too much about it until later, when I thought hard about it. I didn't leave that money there. That same day, my sisters and nephews went to my uncle's pharmacy and Hallmark shop, where my mom had worked also. My mom had always bought Beanie Babies for my nephews from there. My nephew was looking for a specific beanie, and I'd been unable to find it for months. That day, they found it at the shop. My uncle didn't remember ever seeing that one before, and he took care of the ordering. A few days later, I was sleeping. I was exhausted from the funeral and was taking time off from work. Nobody was home. The window was open, and I was dozing peacefully when I heard quite clearly, Carrie, Carrie. I sat up, and my heart was pounding. I heard my mother. She was calling me, as if I wasn't supposed to be sleeping, like she always used to do if she thought I were oversleeping. One of the things that my mom always did when she was alive that annoyed me was to yell my name from the bottom of the steps. I heard it so vividly that morning. I want to say it was in my head, but it woke me up, and her voice was as clear as day. My bedroom was the entire length of the top floor of a Cape Cod house. I had my own smoke detector up there. From that day on, whenever I would get really upset about losing my mother, that silly smoke detector would beep. Beep, 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 beep. I changed the battery. Beep. But it happened only when I was upset, or thinking of her. The crystals on the phone began to fall off regularly, where they never did before. The phone in the kitchen, which had a speakerphone function, would click on its own violation when someone was on the telephone. It happened about 5 times. That too had never done that before. Suddenly, everything just stopped. No more odd happenings. Then my father went into a coma. Several friends from out of town were staying at the house and keeping a vigil with us at the hospital. One evening, everyone was at the hospital but a friend of the family named Jenny. She had heard the stories of my mom's hauntings and the smoke detector going off. She was reading a book, alone in the house, and the smoke detector in the downstairs hallway started going crazy. Jenny got up, walked into the hallway, looked up at it and said, "Miss Harley, we aren't ready to let Don go yet. You can't have him. Is that okay?" The minute she said that, the smoke detector beeped one more time, and it never did again. It completely freaked her out. Shortly after my father died, all strange happenings ceased little by little. They do not happen anymore. I wish they would. It was almost nice thinking that my mom and our dad were hanging around and watching us. Thanks for reading.
As a child growing up in this home, I've experienced things I couldn't explain. Things like the feeling of being watched, as well as the feeling of dread every time I was in the basement. My brother and I shared a rumpus room as a bedroom. In this room, we would often hear a lady screaming and a baby crying in the basement. We would often run screaming straight to my mom, but of course, she never believed us. The home had a real bad vibe to it, and it also had an aura that we couldn't explain. It was almost like the house was suffocating the life out of us. You could certainly feel the negative energy permeating. It had such a profound effect on my parents that they began fighting so bad that their relationship ended in divorce. I blamed the home. My baby sister would have nightmares. She would often see a man in her room pointing a rifle at her. Each time she would recognize this man, she would let out a blood-curdling scream, which would send my mom flying through the room. The presence would vanish pretty quickly, and after a few encounters with this entity, she never saw this ghost again. I often saw black shadows in my bedroom. There were 2 of them, and they would stand together, almost as if they were clutching each other's hands, and stare at me. It may have been only a few seconds, but in that moment of sheer terror, it seemed like hours to me. Whatever they were haunted me for years, and eventually stopped when I was 16. Shortly after those incidents at 16, my brother was unfortunately killed. He was a victim of a hit-and-run accident. Almost immediately after his death, my mother started to feel his presence, and even crediting him for saving her life. My mom was standing on a chair changing a light bulb. She lost her balance, and that was when she felt a small set of hands on her legs. She said that she legitimately felt a force hold her, as if those so-called imaginary hands stabilized her and prevented her from falling. On another occasion, my mom was washing the back landing floor and didn't realize that she was so close to the basement stairs. As she stood up, she lost her balance, and as she was trying to regain her balance, she felt a small set of hands on her bum push her back up to the landing. My mom would have died that day if she had fallen down the stairs. After my grandma had died, my mom was making her bed. Just as she went to fluff her pillows, there was an indentation of a head on an unused pillow on her bed. She believes it was her grandma. My mom would often come home and hear a male voice talking to her dog. The reason why we know it was speaking to her dog was because the voice said the name Honey, which is obviously the dog's name. The voice sounded so real and so clear that my mom really thought that someone had broken into her home. She quickly searched around, and no one was even there. Often the boarders who lived in the basement would often complain of having their arm grabbed in the middle of the night. They have also told my mom that she has a ghost of an old man in her basement. My mom said she had never seen this ghost or felt him. However, my sister had reported it while she was carrying a basket of laundry up the stairs. Also, her son kept looking back as if he was being chased. We have no clue who is haunting our house, but we feel that we may know who this is, the spirit of this old man. I grew up in a house in New York Mills, New York. I always thought that there was something wrong with me because of the occurrences that went on in this home. That's because, originally, I didn't attribute these supernatural hauntings to be paranormal in the slightest. I would just write them off as stress or a vivid imagination. But hey, if a bunch of other people experience some wacky experiences, then I guess there must be something wacky going on then, right? Anyways, I lived in this house the majority of my life, from the ages of 4 to 17. I always thought I heard and saw things. Mysterious shadows slowly moving around in the home, often late at night, and I gradually grew desensitized to them, because I didn't think much of them. Occasionally, I still saw things that freaked me out, but again, I believe that I was either disturbed or was overly imaginative. I moved back to this home when I was 26 and lived there until I was 35, when financial issues caused the bank to take it from me. This place, I've learned, is very haunted. Even as a child, I would hear low guttural voices, almost as if we're giants whispering to each other. I even saw shadows on the wall at night consistently, the day my grandmother died. My parents even saw a shape move down the stairs. The attic made crazy noises, but it was an old house, right? Wrong. Well, the house had originally been built in 1854 by an old Polish immigrant. He did indeed die there, of a heart attack. He was a good man, and a very good father. In the days when I brought my children to this house, the shadow was seen only going between the children's rooms. Sightings were always on the stairs leading downstairs, or between the upstairs bedrooms. It appears that he is an attentive father checking on his sick children. Just my theory. Well, the children did indeed become scared poopless at whatever it was checking in on them. My second oldest child was diagnosed with night terrors. I went into the area between the rooms and asked him to stop appearing, as it was scaring them, and it stopped for quite a while. A few years later, my wife's aunt came to visit. She walked over to my living room, looked over to the stairway, and ran like heck from the home. She refused to go any further than the kitchen. Well, as I said, we were kicked out of the home by the bank. This house has gone through 6, that's right, 6 owners since we left. It has only been 2 years since then. Why is that, I wonder? When I was 17, my mother, stepfather, and youngest sister moved into a house built around 1899. This is an old house in a steel mill town. It was very dirty when we moved in, with soot in the walls from a coal furnace that used to be in the basement. The first night we stayed there, I slept in the living room in a sleeping bag inside a bay window area. I felt very uneasy, as though I was being watched. Over the course of the next few days, I began to feel more and more uneasy, having heard various odd noises, which I attributed it to being such an old home, and having seen things move out of the corner of my eye. After our light renovations of the home, I took up residence in the basement, and the rest of my family took the other 2 upstairs bedrooms. The basement had several rooms, sections that led to the next, separated by doors. In the area I inhabited, we had a dividing wall built to create more of a room with less open space. One night I was laying in my bed, about to go to sleep after having read a book. I had a small light on next to my bed. Wall to wall, my basement room was about 35 feet long and 20 feet wide. Against the back wall was a small window. I settled into the blankets and looked up at the window and saw a huge black mass that looked like a mound. It started at each corner,
bottom of the wall, and came to a rounded point in front of the window. I was so startled, all I could do was sink into my bed and cover my head. The next night I slept on the upstairs couch. Other occurrences. I was walking down the basement stairs, old wooden steps, very slick, about 14 of them, and slipped on the 5th step. The right side was blocked by a wall all the way down, but the left side opened to the basement, and next to the stairs was a tire jack with a metal pole sticking straight up. I just so happened to grab the rail before I slipped off the left side. I would have impaled myself on the tire jack, and when I did, my head flew back, and standing at the top of the stairs was a skinny male figure, shoulder-length dark hair, white t-shirt, jeans, and no face. He was quite solid. There was a window behind him in the hallway, hazing a white glow around him. My mother was pulling the lawnmower back into the basement by the way of the cellar door. She lost her footing and started to fall backwards. When she said she felt a hand in the small of her back, pushing her upright. A few years ago, I had LASIK surgery and moved to recover. I went to my mom's to sleep, away from my kids. I had decided to take a bath while my mom was watching TV. I got into the tub, and I started to hear the basement door slamming shut. This is a normal occurrence in the home, but this time, I thought it was Mom. I yelled out, "Are you up here, Mom?" And she said, "Yes, I'm watching TV." The doors kept slamming shut until I got out of the tub. I've seen things placed at the center of the dining room table fly off into the floor. When I had my first daughter, she was terrified to be left with my mom at the home. She was about 2 years old, playing in the dark front bedroom, when she said, "Thomas, don't." Thomas was the name of my sister's boyfriend, who wasn't home at the time. She was yelling at Thomas for taking her toys while she was trying to play. Another time we were in the basement, in my former room. She was in the doorway when she said, "Mommy, who's that man?" and pointed into the bay section with the bay window, shaped like the stairs bay section, just below it. She's gone into screaming fits upon entry of the front bedroom. I've seen the image of Joe walking behind me, reflected in the computer screen. We've all seen his head poking around the wall in the kitchen, in the area of the basement door. The basement doors between the kitchen and the second bedroom at the back of the home. My mom had the shower curtain ripped open on her. We hear heavy footsteps in the basement when no one's home. Our Joe seems harmless enough. But what of the black mass in the basement? Is there another force to the house beside Joe? Sometimes we think so. When I was in my early 20s, I had one of only a few experiences with what I would consider the supernatural that truly frightened me. We were in our home in North Carolina, which was on top of a mountain with a terrific view of the Smokies. Everything about the home was warm and comfortable, except one night. That night, there was no indication that something really evil was about to show itself. We all went to bed as normal. My dad wasn't home with us, so my little sister was upstairs with my mother in her room. My brother was in his bedroom, and I was in mine. Everything settled down to a noiseless, deep darkness. The next thing I knew, our dog, a German Shepherd Collie mix, jumped up on the bed and started to walk up onto my chest and stared down at me. It occurred to me that there was very little weight to her. Now this was a 50-pound plus dog. I knew something wasn't right. Then, as I looked at her and tried to speak, her eyes started to glow an eerie reddish glow. The whole feel was of some extreme evil. This was absolutely not my dog. It was something trying to take on her image to get to me. I somehow jumped from under the being and reached for the light switch. As the light came on, there was nothing in the room. I thought perhaps it was a dream, but I truly did get to the switch. The lights did come on, and I did feel the being walk up on me. I truly don't believe, in my heart, that it was a dream. I ran through the house to make certain that the evil was gone, and I wanted to make sure my dog was okay. Sure enough, our dog was in my brother's room and looked up sleepily when I opened the door. She was fine, and not at all the evil thing that had been in my room. The evil tried unsuccessfully a couple of additional times to get to me. I'll put these experiences in writing soon. However, the first occasion was the worst, as he used a familiar, loved creature as its disguise. This story is about a 3-year-old girl who haunts this place. The trailer my brother has rented has been rented many times, so I don't know its history, but his 3-year-old stepdaughter will be talking to herself, so he thought. And so one day, she was crying, and her mom asked her what was wrong. She said the man grabbed her by the arm, and her mom asked her what man, and she said the one that talks to me. And so when her mom looked at her arm, she had a red ring around her arm. One day she was in the living room sitting on her knees, looking up and talking, and my brother asked her who she was talking to, and she turned around, and she said the man. Her mom took pictures of her, so when they downloaded it to the computer, and on the first picture, where she was looking up, there was a bright circle on that wall where she was looking. In the picture where she turned around, the circle moved down, and in a mirror that was all the way to the top of the wall, there was a man's head looking down at her. And when she showed it, she said, "Mommy, that's the man that talks to me, and sometimes he hurts me." I really love your website, and I've been debating sending you my story for some time now. I've always been fascinated with hauntings and ghosts, but I've never had any desire to have direct contact with them myself. However, recent events have confirmed that I've been in direct contact. Whether I like it or not, we came to the conclusion that our apartment was haunted shortly before we moved out. We had already made the decision to leave based on another of other factors, but realizing it was haunted really sealed the deal. We lived there for 2 years and experienced stuff that can be chalked up to living in an old apartment, but we've experienced so much of it that it just doesn't make any sense. When we first looked at the place, I was not into it at all. I felt that it had a really crappy vibe, and the landlady was crazy, but my husband really loved the place, so I agreed to move in, and we both worked really hard to make it a home. The first day we moved in, some neighborhood kids scribbled "This is the scary ghost house" in permanent marker on the front steps. It may seem silly, but it certainly gave me some reservations. We rented the whole first floor in the basement. I had been petrified of the basement since we moved in. It would not go down there alone for months. In an attempt to cleanse the apartment, we lit sage smudges and clapped out the corners, and we sprinkled holy water everywhere. I'm sure it helped, but I'm too scared to think of how things would be if we hadn't done any of that. Every major appliance broke down when we moved in. We had inexplicable computer problems. We could never seem to get the house clean. We were burglarized twice. We're both people with lots of friends, and we love entertaining. Strangely, people wouldn't come to the apartment. Bands would stay over, but they always stayed over once
and never came back. Whenever I put something down and looked for it later, it was never where I put it, and I would spend 10 minutes looking for it before it reappeared, right where I put it down in the first place. Our bed shook in the middle of the night, which is frightening. It always happened when I was almost asleep, and I tried to write it off as my imagination. We both had inexplicable health problems. We were constantly tired and worn out, and we became very depressed and negative. Finally, one morning, my husband confirmed all of my suspicions. I'd asked him before if he thought the house is haunted, and he always said no. Uncategorically denied any such thing. So I stopped mentioning stuff to him because I didn't want to freak either of us any more than we already were. However, all the same things had been happening to him, and he confirmed that the bed shaking thing happened when I was out of town, and he was sleeping alone too. In fact, he has seen whatever it is at the top of the basement steps at least 3 times. He describes it as a crouched old man heading back down the basement steps. He fell down the basement steps when he first moved in, and the first weekend he was home with crutches. I had to be out of town, and he was home alone. There was no way he could get around without the crutches, and when he woke up one morning, the crutches weren't in the bedroom. He found them in the living room, at the other end of the apartment. During the last summer we lived there, the upstairs apartment was unoccupied and being renovated. No one was up there. One night when we were lying in bed, we heard footsteps upstairs in the room overhead. We went up to check it out, and there was no one there. We kept our cat's water and food bowls at the top of the basement steps. The cat started waking up at 4 or 5 and would want me to stay with her while she ate. I think that whatever was in the house was harassing her when she tried to eat, and if I was there, it would leave her alone. Knowing all this confirmed and explained a lot of stuff. We felt like we were struggling to keep our heads above water. We both felt lethargic and depressed. When we would come home, we both did a full walk of the apartment and checked every room before we felt like we could settle in. My other experience, that I am sure of, is a much more positive one. I'm very close to my stepfather, and I was very close to his mother as well. I consider her my third grandmother. She died last year, and my stepfather was devastated. We planned to bury her ashes in the same cemetery her husband and mother are buried in. My stepfather was in a relationship with a woman for 9 years who died in his arms, and she is buried there as well. When we got to the cemetery, we discovered that a plot had not been dug for my grandmother's ashes, and my stepfather couldn't remember where they were buried, or whether or not they had headstones or flat stones. My whole family was wandering around the cemetery, reading all the headstones and trying to find out where the family was buried. Finally, I asked my grandmother's mother to help me find them. Where were they? I turned around and tripped over a buried flat stone. It was the marker for my stepfather's girlfriend who had died in his arms. All 3 graves were in a row, and they were so overgrown with grass, I doubt I would ever have found them without help. Hi again. I submitted a story about the apartment I used to live in a few weeks ago, but I have another story about the house my family and I are currently living in, which is my grandmother's. I'm not sure what to make of it, but I think the house my family and I currently live in may be haunted. We've been living there for almost 2 years now. First of all, my great-grandparents, my dad's grandparents, were living there, then passed away at that house before I was born. Then, when I was 7 years old, my grandfather passed away in the same house, of cancer. I remember that. because my parents and I spent the night there, the night he died. I'm not sure, but sometimes I think the house is haunted, and other times I'm not so sure. It's been months since I've heard any noises or felt anything unusual, but that's how it's been. Another important note, my grandma doesn't live there. She lives with her boyfriend in Castroville, a small town about 30 minutes away. She's only there for a few weeks and stays for one night, then goes back to Castroville. Anyway, a couple weeks after we moved in, my husband said he wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but he sometimes heard footsteps in the kitchen late at night, after everyone was asleep, and he was the only one up. I hadn't heard anything yet, until a few weeks after he told me that. Another thing that happened was I found a cabinet door open in the laundry room, when no one had been in there. My son couldn't have reached it, because it's too high. Then early one morning, I heard noises in the kitchen and laundry room, and footsteps too. I was really scared, too scared to investigate, so I just sat up in bed and listened. Of course, everyone else was sleeping. My husband was also awake in bed one night, while everyone was asleep, and I happened to wake up too. He asked me, "Did you see that?" I didn't see anything, so I asked him what he saw, and he said that he saw something round and black, hovering about 4 feet from the ground, in the doorway. He said that he thought it was a spider, but it was too big. Then he said after a few seconds it kind of vibrated and dashed away real fast. He dismissed it as his imagination, due to the fact that he was so tired, and so did I. A few months later, my 7-year-old son said he saw a foot shadow floating back and forth in front of his door. His door was closed, and we were still in bed, but he said he saw it through the crack under the door. I told him he was dreaming, but he said he was awake, and insisted that's what he saw. I've never seen anything directly, but occasionally I've seen a figure walk by in another room from my peripheral vision when I know I'm the only adult in the home. The figure is too tall to be my son, but a little shorter than my husband. And of course, when I look directly where I saw it, no one is around. I told a friend at work about my grandma's house, and she said let me borrow your digital camera for the evening. I took several pictures, all at night, and several orbs came out in some of the pictures. I'll have to send those if I can find them. In one of them, there's an orb that appears to have a face resembling my grandfather's. Then late one night when my husband was away at a DJ gig, I was asleep and woke to the strong feeling that I was not alone in the room. I didn't have a dream or anything. I just suddenly awoke, startled, and my heart was pounding. It felt like there was another presence in the room with me, and I scanned the room good, but I didn't see anyone. That was really, really weird, and I've never had that happen to me before. I didn't like that feeling of it at all. I felt scared. It's been months since anything out of the ordinary has happened, but recently while I was laying in bed, my kids were asleep, and my husband was at work. I kept hearing noises in the kitchen and laundry area again. It took me a while to fall asleep, and I was a little scared. I was worried someone was trying to get in the home, but was too scared to get up and look, so I took a golf club and put it next to the bed. The weird thing is, we finally purchased a digital camera recently and took several photos in the home with no orbs appearing, but the pictures were all taken during the day. I'm going to take a few pictures at night to see if anything came out. I asked my grandma about the home, and she said it's not haunted, and nothing's ever happened there, and she's never heard nor seen anything. I even told my dad, and he says the same. Does anybody have any ideas? I've been looking at your website for the last couple of weeks, and I've read some of the experiences people had with the supernatural. I've had several experiences in my life. The first one that I can really remember is when my grandmother died. I was 16 years old and lived most of my life with my grandma. The night she passed away from cancer, I was devastated since I never got to say goodbye to her. But the night she passed, she came back to say goodbye to me. I remember being in that state between awake and asleep. I remember her coming to my bed, sitting beside me, and telling me she was perfectly fine and so happy to be with my grandpa. I told her I loved her, and she left. The second thing that happened was about 2 months after I had my third child. We moved into a beautiful home in Northwest Ohio. It had been totally remodeled, except for one room upstairs, in which we made into a toy room for the kids. My daughter, who was 2 at the time, was in that room playing when she started screaming for me. I ran up the stairs to see what was wrong with her, and she was in a corner with her hands protecting her head and screaming for the bad man to go away. I did not see a man. I picked her up and headed back downstairs, and when I was on the 3rd or 4th step down, I felt as if someone was behind me and very angry with me. Needless to say, I ran the rest of the way down. Also in that home, I was in the kitchen washing my son's bottles, and directly behind the sink was our stove. I'd placed my son in the carrier by the stove. My daughters had brought in their stuffed animals that my mother had gotten them for Easter, and laid them down beside the stove. Now, these stuffed animals were the kind that make noise, as in the duck quacked, the pig oinked, and the cow mooed. I know my son was just a little bit too young to be able to reach over his carrier and play with the toys, let alone make them talk. While I was washing his bottles, the duck started in. I thought nothing of it. I thought maybe it was just malfunctioning. But then the cow started in, and a few seconds after that, the pig. I turned around, and my son was just all smiles. Needless to say, I hightailed it out of the home. I always hated to go into the basement of that house. It just felt wrong for me to be down there. But one afternoon, I had no choice but to go down. I had to take a bag of old clothing down to be stored. I thought I would just leave them on the floor, right at the bottom of the steps. So I leaned down to retie the bag, and as soon as I looked up, I saw 2 little girls standing right in front of me. They were not my little girls. They looked about 7 and 5 years old, and let me tell you, I didn't waste any time getting up these stairs. They did not make me feel very safe. I did some research on the home and found that the house was built in the mid-1800s. A man and his family lived in the home, and he had 2 daughters. The man owed some money to a loan shark, and when he couldn't repay his debt, the loan shark killed the 2 daughters and buried them in the basement. My family and I didn't stay long in that house. The longer we stayed, the more evil it seemed to be. The most recent experience has been for the last 2.5 years. My father passed away, and I've had a very hard time dealing with his passing. I was made to make all of his decisions when it came to taking him off of life support. I felt, and still feel, guilty for letting him go.
I know that my dad comes to visit me, and I hope he never stops visiting. I don't let anyone smoke in my home, and my dad hated it. He hated to go outside in the garage. He was always on my case about it. Well, now that Dad has passed away, there are many nights and even days that you can smell cigarette smoke so plainly, like it's right next to you. I know it's my dad, and I tell him to take it to the garage, and he does. I know that he's looking out for me and my family. I just wish he would show himself to me just one more time. Thank you so much for your website. It's a comfort knowing that I'm not alone, and definitely not crazy. This story involves my aunt and uncle, and took place in the late 70s and early 80s. My aunt and uncle, and then baby cousin, lived in a nice modest house in Upland, California, a very nice little city near Panola in Ontario. The niceness of the house didn't last long, and almost immediately, my family began experiencing weird things. Every night on the way to bed, my uncle would latch close the door to the spare bedroom across the hall from he and my aunt's master bedroom. Every morning, as he passed the same door, it would discreetly unlatch and push itself open on its own. This same room once locked in my uncle's sister, with her and my uncle both frantically turning and pushing and pulling on the door as things flew out of the closet at her. All at once, everything stopped, and they both jumped back to have the door unlatch and push itself open, as it always did. Needless to say, my uncle's sister didn't stay much longer in the bedroom, let alone the home. When my aunt would leave the home to run errands in the daytime, she would return to find all the pictures from the wall on the ground, not knocked over, but propped against the wall, directly under the nail it was once hanging on. This would happen nearly every time the house was left empty, no matter how many times they would put the items back on the wall. Another nightly struggle is the pounding up and down the walls, like someone banging their fist across the center of the wall, back and forth, back and forth. My own grandma, as well as my mom and dad, witnessed this and hightailed it out of there ASAP. One day in the summer, my cousin, who was about 2 or 3, was sitting in a high chair next to a long hallway. My aunt was just outside the back door. My cousin asked, "Mommy, who's that man in the hallway?" My aunt, not quite listening, asked back somewhat distracted, "What man?" My cousin proceeded to explain that the man looked like her Uncle Mike, who lived out of state. When my family had finally decided that enough was enough, they decided to sell the home and move to Kalamazoo, just outside of Yucapeka, California. On one of their last nights in the home, it seemed as if everything was going crazy. The pounding was out of control. There were loud bangs and unusual noises everywhere, and their dog was at the front door, its hair on end, and growling out the front porch. My aunt and uncle looked outside to the wraparound driveway and saw their van rocking back and forth as if people were inside jumping around. Within seconds, everything had stopped. Once my family had moved out, they eventually learned that their house was built over an old Indian burial ground. I've tried to ask my aunt more about this story, but she'll rarely talk about it, and I think is subconsciously trying to block it out. My aunt and uncle are very straight-laced and don't make up these sort of things, and I think that if my other family members had not been there to witness a lot of them, I would not even know about these occurrences in Upland. I've had to rely on my mom retelling me what she remembers, my aunt telling her as it was happening. There are probably many more things that went on that I would love to find out. I still don't even know the address of this old home. See if the place still exists. As for the significance of Uncle Mike, my cousin's Uncle Mike had long, black flowing hair with darkly tanned skin and often wore a leather band across his forehead. Think 70s rocker fashion, looking somewhat like an Indian perhaps. This happened quite recently. Well, a few weeks ago actually. Apart from what I think are a few cases of what I think are more likely sleep paralysis with resulting hallucinations, this is the only experience I felt that was truly, well, weird. A bit of background first. I live alone and rent an apartment in a newly built block, one of 3, of low-rise units. These were built on the grounds of an old public primary school, which is over 100+ years old. The far end of the strip of where the school used to be is preserved, and still has the school hall, a beautiful sandstone building, and is used for public functions. My particular block is built where the playgrounds etc. used to be. I know this as I grew up in the area, and remember the school when I was a teenager, though I did not go there, and remember what it used to look like beforehand. I'm personally unaware of any hauntings in the area, nor am I unaware of the history of the site, as I've not researched it. There is a fairly modern funeral based directly across the road containing offices, a small chapel, and a large garage with several hearses. Whilst I assume bodies are prepared there, etc. there are no burials. The story. I had a very hard day at work, have been under a lot of stress. It was a Friday night, fairly late, and I eventually decided to go to bed. I had a lot of trouble sleeping, as my mind was working 100 miles per hour. You know the feeling. I simply couldn't turn it off. After staring at the ceiling for an hour, I became frustrated, and finally, I thought I'd open my mind and try to meditate. It was an effort. But after almost half an hour of this, I drifted off. Shortly after, I had an odd feeling, and I woke up and opened my eyes. I immediately noticed a web of white mist floating above me. This network of yellow-white colored mist was basically sort of like a spider web about a meter above my bed, and almost stretching across the entire room. Actually, the whole room was a bit foggy in general. I blinked, and then did a I don't think so double take, and rubbed my eyes. No sleep paralysis this time. It was still there. I tried to focus my eyes on it, and it was not easy. But what I saw was what I thought were transparent faces, outlined in the mist. The effect was very like the outline of an invisible person in smoke. One moved through on my right side and looked directly at me. The fear started to hit me now, but I tried to calm myself down and think rationally. Just hold on here. I might be seeing things just because I'm so tired and stressed, and I've just woken up too. I forced myself to be distracted and take my attention away. I shifted position in bed, closed my eyes, rubbed them, blinked them several times, and looked over at my clock radio. It was about 1:10, I think. Then looked back up, and it was still there. I then started to feel a slight vibration in my bed. Not a strong one, just like you'd feel the ground at a station as the train went past. I remember thinking, what the? And thought at first it was just my body shivering because I was cold or I had a muscle twitch. My attention on this now, I flexed my muscles a few times and then tried to hold still and feel it was still there. The bed was definitely vibrating, even a bit more pronounced now. I was getting quite frightened and not knowing what else to do, short of running out of the bedroom. I began to recite a prayer softly and also verbalize what I wanted any spirits to leave the place. Basically anything that came to mind, just in case I wasn't imagining things. After about a minute of this, it faded. After a while, I wanted to go back to sleep, as I was super tired, but every minute or so, I was worried it was still there, so I snapped my eyes open to check. It had gone. A few minutes after that, I fell asleep again, with no more events that night. Now after the event, when I think about it, I wonder if it was just my imagination or something else. What surprised and concerned me is that I felt very lucid. I felt quite clear-headed. The only other event which is vaguely similar, which I dismissed at the time, was about a year ago when I woke up in the early hours of the morning to see a similar face above and to the left of my bed, no mist, looking at me. I rather sheepishly recall in the shock yelling and then punching it. Honestly, who punches a ghost? Seemed to work though. The action either jolted me out of my sleep hallucination or made whatever it was go away. I'm not sure what to make of the above event, to be honest. As a general comment in my apartment itself, I don't typically feel anything strange or a presence, and other than this, there have been no odd things going on. Plenty of unusual sounds, mind you, but I'm fairly sure these come mostly from the neighbors, etc. Usually from what I read about hauntings, they tend to be more or less repetitive, and don't just hit you like that and go away. So I'm still not 100% convinced it wasn't a half dream. But still, what a freak out. I now believe that I officially have a poltergeist in my home. At first, my live-in boyfriend thought I was nuts. Now, he believes it too. The first day I moved in, I was doing laundry in the basement. My cats both began acting strangely and circled me whenever I was in the basement. I thought they were just hungry and trying to get my attention. But when I waited out to go upstairs, I had this terrible feeling that someone was standing behind me, staring right through me. The 12-year-old inside me told me to run up the stairs like I did when I was a kid. And I did. Then, one day, I was looking for my favorite tank top. I couldn't find it anywhere, and could swear that I brought it to this new house. I dismissed it as having it left somewhere. Third day we lived in this house, I broke my ankle playing softball. I ended up having to sleep on the couch in the living room. Throughout my 2-month stay on the sofa, I could swear I heard someone going up and down the basement steps, cold breezes, etc. I just thought that the pain medication was kicking in, and that my mind was playing tricks on me. After I could walk again, and venture into the basement to do the laundry, I still had the same feeling that someone was standing behind me and staring at me. One night, I was getting ready to fall asleep in the bedroom when my boyfriend was out of town fishing. I had both dogs in the room, one on the bed, and the cats too, and the dog on the floor next to the bed. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud thump, like a book had just fallen off a bookshelf and onto the hardwood floor. Well, I don't have any bookshelves in the bedroom, nor was anything on the floor, except for clothes, when I turned the light on. Just this last week, I came home to discover the bed neatly made, pillows stacked just so, and the blankets pulled up neatly and turned down. When I thanked my boyfriend for making the bed, he just stared at me. He said, "What are you talking about?" And I said that I didn't know what got into him to make the bed so nice, but it was a nice thing to do. He said though that I came home on my lunch hour and made the bed. He had been gone all day and didn't come home until I was already home. The basement lights continually go on and off. The light switches don't work, and the light bulbs are new. The circuits have been checked and everything is fine. I never know when they will work. The other night, the toilet handle in the bathroom jiggled for 10 minutes straight at 3 a.m., and we both heard it. The night before last, my boyfriend witnessed a light come on in the hallway outside our bedroom and had heard the light switch flip. The light faded, and later when he got up to go to the bathroom, the kitchen light was on, which had been off when we went to bed. Last night, I saw a light come into our bedroom from the hallway and then fade. I also heard a very loud thump at the foot of my bed. When I got up, only my tennis shoes were in the floor, hardwood floor, and nothing else had fallen off or was out of place. It was so loud, I physically jumped when I heard it. My boyfriend was sound asleep. I am convinced that someone or something is totally screwing with me. This is a very personal story to my family, but I think your readers might find it as fascinating as I do. My mother grew up in an infamous mental institution in Massachusetts, now closed, and I won't name the facility for privacy's sake. She was placed in state custody in 1948 at 6 years old because my grandmother, a Portuguese gypsy immigrant and closet psychotic, claimed she was mentally disturbed. In actuality, my grandmother was just not capable of raising her, so she successfully pawned her off on the state. My mother was not only a beautiful and innocent child, but was totally mentally capable and 100% sane. In those days, there was no system in place to accurately assessing a child's medical condition. They simply took the parents' word for it. After living at various orphanages and state facilities, she ended up at this institution just outside of Boston. The place is notorious for paranormal activity, even on the outer grounds where some of the buildings once stood. She was about 12 when she got there. She said that there were many physically and mentally incapacitated young people there, and the stories she told us about the school or institution were both heartbreaking and terrifying. There were mental abuses, deprivations, beatings, medical experiments on patients, and cruel punishments galore. So-called professional care was barbaric, and even the terminology was outdated. My mother's own records, which I've seen myself, showed her mental assessment as moron, even though she said she was never really tested by any mental health professional. When she was around 13, she began helping the patients whenever she could. She would bandage their injuries, break up fights, and speak to the matrons on behalf of those who could not speak. This created enemies among the staff, who knew she wasn't handicapped and who felt she was a threat to their employment. Therefore, whenever they could, they punished her severely. One such punishment led to a horrifying encounter with the supernatural. One dark, stormy afternoon, Mom had words with a matron, trying to tell her that certain handicapped children were frightened of the thunder and that they should not be forced to go outside to exercise that afternoon. The matron appeared to give in, then asked my mother to please go down into the cellar of the building to get to the rain gear for those who wanted to go outside. Mom was terrified of that cellar, and the matron knew it. There was this long, steep, narrow and rickety stairway, ending at a long dark hallway with no windows, and just a tiny yellowish light bulb in the ceiling. At the end of the hallway, there was a cabinet that contained raincoats, boots, etc. When my mother hesitantly stepped onto the stairway, the matron slammed a door, bolted it shut behind her, and shut off the light. My mother screamed and pounded on the door for an hour, only to be laughed at by matrons who had been instructed to let her spend the entire night down there. The stairs being steep and dangerous, she decided that she would rather creep to the bottom and at least huddle on the damp floor. As she descended, she noticed a dim light coming from the long hallway beneath her. She came to the bottom of the stairs and looked around. She said she saw a man in a dark jumpsuit about 20 feet from her, leaping against a wall and just smiling at her. She thought he must have been a custodian, so she walked towards him, asking him to please let her out. But as she approached him, he kept getting further away. She realized he was not a sullen being, and that the dim light seemed to be coming from his outline. The light began to fade, and she found herself screaming again, only in the total dark of the dingy basement. She was disoriented and stumbled forward until she bumped into the cabinet which held the rain gear. As she squinted in the dark, she began to make out shapes forming on either side of the cabinet. What appeared to be a pair of detached hands forming a clawed shape were each coming from around opposite sides of the cabinet and heading for her. She turned and ran, faint with terror, until she tripped on the bottom step. Frozen with fear, she could only sit at the bottom step and cover her face with her hands. After a minute or so, she peeked through her fingers down the hallway. The strange dim light was back. She chanced to look down, and what she saw filled her with horror. One of the smoky floating hands were reaching for her skirt, as if to pull at it. She again screamed and ran back up the stairs, tripping and falling several times in the dark, convinced she was being chased. The air was cold, and she heard a strange rustling sound behind her as she frequently climbed. When she reached the top of the stairs, she pounded furiously on the door and found that it had been unlocked. She never found out who unlocked it, but she didn't care either. She ran all the way to her room and hid on her bed. She never told the school staff what had happened, fearing reprisals, and she never set foot in that cellar again, despite the punishment of defiance. She's fine today, despite her horrific youth. There were many other strange things happening during her stay, but I'm considering a book about them, and I wanted to reap the benefits of the sales if it happens. I'll save the creepiest stuff for that. I've had many paranormal experiences since I was a young child. At the age of 4, my mother and grandmother would visit the graves of my father and grandfather, staying all day. I would play with the little girl there, while my grandmother and mother sat and talked. They believed I had an imaginary playmate. Both are now dead themselves. I decided to check the records of the cemetery, and had little trouble since it is a small place. I found one girl that could have been the one that I played with. Her name was Mary Jane Walker, and she died in 1866, at the age of 9 years of age. My husband and I decided to see if we could find the girl's grave. I told him to check the back of the cemetery because that was where we played. He found the grave. I asked Mary Jane if I could take her picture. I took 3 of the grave, and one of my husband, sitting on a tree stump not far away. I had the pictures developed. All the pictures were normal, except for the one of my husband where there appears to be a vortex in it. I've looked for all the usual problems, but can find no rational explanation for this. I now feel that I have proof of my friend's existence. My husband and I rented a home in southwest Detroit in the 1980s that was very haunted. The first thing that happened was when I was waiting for the gas company to come turn the gas on. I felt as though there was someone watching me, and I smelled pipe tobacco. I figured, okay, I'm alone in a strange place. I also thought that maybe the people who lived in the front part of the house used pipe tobacco. I found out later that these people were from India and were visiting that country. They moved out within a week of returning to the US. All the problems in the house seemed to originate in the attic. There was a log cabin built up there for children to play in. It was complete with glass in the windows and a drawstring latch for the door. I was only in there once, but the feeling of uneasiness I felt was real. We never allowed our children to play in it. The attic door had no lock, but my 5-year-old daughter got locked in and was screaming for us to let her out. Although you could hear any noise from upstairs, we never heard her. The door opened on its own. I started to dream about an old Indian woman with a pockmarked face. Since this was a dream, I never told anyone about it. One day, a woman I had become friendly with asked me if my mother was visiting. I told her I sure hope not, since my mother was dead. She said that she saw a woman with long black hair in my bedroom window. This sort of freaked me out, since I was dreaming of that Indian woman, and she had long black hair. One day this friend was visiting me, and we were sitting in the kitchen having coffee and talking about nothing really. She seemed to go into a daze and was starting to go up to my attic. In fact, she was insisting that she was going. I got her back to the table and sitting down when something punched her head hard enough to leave a red mark. She left and refused to come visit anymore. My husband and I had cleaned out the basement, but yet my kids found a Ouija board down there. They showed us where it was, and we got rid of it right away. We don't mess with that thing. Things seemed to quiet down for a couple of weeks when the apartment in front of us was rented to a young couple. They started to have problems right away. The keys hanging on the wall would begin to sway. The rocker in the front room would start rocking by itself. At first, things only happened at night, but people decided to contact this thing, and things got bad from then. She would get phone calls, and when she answered, no one would be on the line, except one time. She told me a voice told her to get out. We are Christians, and decided enough was enough. We had to have help. I turned on the radio to listen to evangelical echoes and called a prayer line for suggestions on what to do. This program wasn't on yet, but another one was, and someone on that program was praying in the spirit. Suddenly from the basement came an unearthly howl. Needless to say, this woman and I got out of the house and waited on the front porches for our husbands to get home. While all this was going on, my husband never noticed anything. One night, my nephew was spending the night, and while he was praying, this thing shot from our apartment to the other one, banging things in its haste to leave. My nephew refused to stay another night. One night, my husband was in bed sleeping, and I was on my way up when I asked the man in the next apartment to go wake him up and tell him to come sleep on the couch. He asked me what was wrong, and I told him I could see my husband in pieces. He did, and the couch was occupied that night. The only thing my husband noticed was that one night we were watching TV, and it sounded like a dresser was being dragged down the stairs. He heard that. We moved from there, and the next place was no better. Whatever was there caused arguments. My nephew and his then girlfriend were constantly fighting, and it got so bad that my husband and I started fighting as well. This was something we normally didn't do. We had the normal arguments that married people usually have, but this was getting serious. Even one of my children was being affected by this thing. It was appearing to her as a little girl talking to her. At first it was nice to her, But as time went on, it was starting to get mean. We had bought this one house, and it might sound silly, but the best thing that ever happened was that an arsonist burned us out, and we had to move. We have had no problems since. I don't believe this was a ghost, but rather a demon, and why it hasn't followed us, I have no idea, but I thank God that it hasn't. I have more stories, but I've taken up enough time as it is. I'm glad that I can finally tell this story without fear of people ridiculing me. There's a place in Smithfield, Virginia called Bacon's Castle. It's not really a castle, just a gigantic plantation home. They give tours there on a daily basis. It was in the summer of 2003 that I went with a summer creative writing group to tour this magnificent home and plantation. As we toured the home, the tour guide told us all of the kinds of stories of happenings and how the house was shifted from family to family. When we went up the stairs, we were greeted by a sudden draft. As my friends and I sauntered through the home, it didn't get warmer. In fact, it got colder. The best part was when we reached the room where the woman and her husband would have stayed. There was also a small cradle in the center of the room. The tour guide spoke of a woman during the Civil War who stayed in the room for months after her baby was born because something went wrong with the birth, and the child was terribly sick. When the child died, the woman wouldn't leave the cradle. She remained there, convinced she had to rock her to sleep. She wouldn't eat or sleep, and eventually, she too died. As I stared into the room, I didn't notice anything. My friend Crystal had asked me if I felt a breeze. When I said I didn't, she said she didn't either, and pointed at the cradle, which was swaying back and forth noticeably. I didn't really think much of it, and after everyone left, I took a picture and then followed my friends up the stairs to the attic. A few weeks later, I was looking through my pictures, and something caught my eye in the picture of the room with the cradle in it. Sitting in front of the cradle was a woman dressed in Victorian-style dress. She was transparent, and a wispy hand had gripped the cradle. I looked even closer, and it looked as though she was smiling. Hello, my name is Ray, and I would like to share with you the experiences that happened to my small family in 1996. We had been transferred to the Houston area from San Antonio and found a 2-story 4-bedroom home in the Clear Lake City area. A real fix-it-upper, and it was the worst looking home in a very nice community called Green Acres. My brother-in-law Robert and her sister helped us for 6 months in remodeling, cleaning up, and making the place a nice home. Robert had sold his own home 2 years earlier and lived in a travel trailer, but missed his home. He jumped in and was happy to do most of the work and was proud of the results. A month after the house was finished, we found out that Robert had terminal cancer and had less than 6 months to live. The trailer was small, and so my wife and I decided to bring Robert into our home for his final days. We put him downstairs in the formal living room, and with the help of hospice, we knew we could help Robert with a peaceful and quiet death. This was not the case. Robert fought hard for his life and was terrified of death because he had fought in Vietnam and had killed many. He didn't know what was waiting for him on the other side. The end came with Robert fighting to get out of bed. The look on his face was one of horror. As per his request, he was left in his room for 6 hours after his death, and then the funeral home was called and Robert left. Or did he? The week after the funeral,
things started not being right. Odd bumps and sounds from downstairs. Late at night, our dog would not go downstairs after dark, and furniture being moved. One morning, the living room sofa was standing on end with all the cushions still in place. Dining room chairs would be taken and lined along the living room wall, and mirrors would vibrate. We called the hospice minister to the house, and he blessed every room, but Robert still didn't leave. We did. The house stood vacant for a while, and new people moved in, but their stay was short. Neighbors say 2 families came and left. It has been 8 years now, and just a while back I was in the area and went by the home. It sits vacant again with a sale sign in the front yard, standing in front of the window of the room in which Robert died. As I stood there, remembering our last few months at home, a chill ran down my back, and I quickly got into my car to drive away. I sent a story to the site about 2 months ago. Is it my imagination or something paranormal? Well, since then, some new things have happened, and I found out some interesting information that I didn't know before. When I first sent out my story, I told my sister-in-law Jenna about it. She's a Jehovah's Witness too, but a little bit more open-minded than my mother-in-law. Anyway, I told her what I had wrote, and she told me she had a girlfriend when she was a teenager, about 15 years ago, that lived next door to her. The side where I heard the whispering, in the house where the old couple had died. I believe her family bought the house after the couple died. Anyway, she told her that her friend was a little odd, because she had been sleeping with her parents at night, but Jenna had found out later why. One night, she had stayed the night at her friend's house, and they slept in her friend's bed. Early in the morning, Jenna had woken up for some reason, and noticed that her friend was squirming a lot, and moaning, almost like she was doing the deed with someone, but no one was there. Her arms were at her side. So Jenna thought maybe she was having a dream. Then she thought that maybe she had seen imprints in her friend's body. She got startled with this, and woke her friend up, and told her what she had witnessed. Her friend got so upset about it, that she didn't want to talk about it at all, and never did. To say the least, Jenna never got asked again to stay another night. Then there is the other story that my mother-in-law told me recently, about my other sister-in-law's house, Linda, which is ironically across the street from my mother-in-law's, in the other house. About a shadow that lingers in her hallway, shaped like a person. They have all seen it, including my mother-in-law. She swears that there is an explanation for this, but even she has admitted that she can't find one. When she told me about the shadow, I got real nervous, and I started to get goosebumps and got real cold. I told her sometime last year when I stayed the night at Linda's house. I was sleeping on her couch in the living room, my back to the hallway. There was a small light on where the fish tank was, so it wasn't completely dark. For some reason I woke up and turned around, and I saw this dark shadow move from the open hallway and disappear into the instance of Linda's kitchen. I was startled at first, but then got up to investigate things, to see maybe it was the shadow of the fish tank, but there was no way it could have been with the position where the tank was. So I went back to sleeping, thinking it was just my imagination, and I never told anyone of that incident. That was until my mother-in-law said something. She told me not to say anything about it to Linda because she gets freaked out about it, and she said she'll still be looking for a logical explanation for it. Good luck on finding one in all 3 houses, I was thinking to myself. But one last thing. Back at my mother-in-law's house,
A couple of weeks ago, my niece Christine was staying the night, and my niece told me that when she got to the bathroom in the middle of the night, she came out running, screaming, and petrified out of the hallway. She told my niece, crying hysterically, that when she turned the corner to go into the hallway, that she saw a shadow figure walking towards her. My niece went to look, and nothing was there, and my 2-year-old daughter will not go near that hallway at all. One time I went to carry her down there to show her nothing was down there at all, and she started crying real hard, and grabbing my neck, and wouldn't let go, shaking badly. So whatever is in my mother-in-law's house is probably the same thing that are in the other 2 homes. Makes me wonder if it goes on in the other neighbors' houses. I was doing some just for fun ghost hunting with a couple of my friends one night in a cemetery on an old gravel road. 2 of my friends were out in the cemetery looking around, and my other friend decided to stay in the car. As the 2 guys were out in the far corner of the cemetery, I looked to the center of the graveyard and seen something that made me lose my breath for a few seconds. A blurry gray figure floated above one of the gravestones, and then looked to run through the air across 3 other stones, and then drop right behind another stone. After it disappeared, I asked my friend in the car with me if he had seen it too, and he said he did, and he was just as freaked out as me. It was not light that created this, because it was pitch black out there. It was my first, and so far only time, I've seen something like a ghost. Thank you for letting me share my story. I know this one was kinda short, but I appreciate it anyway. Hi, my name is Louise, and I live in Oxfordshire, England. The story I'm about to tell you happened only a few weeks ago and scared me and my friend to death. It was about 9:30 on a Sunday night, and I was bored, so I decided to call my friend Heather. We were talking about the usual, when all of a sudden, you could hear someone on the line breathing. Heather and I both said at the same time, "Do you hear that?" As we listened, it got louder until there was complete silence. At first we thought maybe one of our brothers or sisters were messing about, and picked up the phone on the other end. We both checked our houses, and no one was in there. My parents had gone out for a meal, and my brother and sister were out, and Heather didn't have any siblings, and there's only one phone in her house. Anyways, we forgot about it, and after about 10 minutes of talking, we heard it again, and this time, the voice said, "Help, I'm close." We both really freaked out, and said what the voice repeated it again, and then went. I told Heather that I would phone her later, and about an hour later, I phoned back, and we didn't hear anything for a while until the shriek came from the phone, from what sounded like a girl. We got so scared, and as soon as our parents got home, I told them what happened, and they said maybe our phone lines got crossed with someone else's. We still don't know who was on the line to this day. I know this wasn't very scary, but thanks for reading. Well, I've been a ghost hunter for quite some time now. I've submitted a few areas under the California section of the haunted places. I recently moved to Arkansas and bought a home in April. 3-in-1 rock house with a huge pond on 1.6 acres in Booneville, Arkansas. I fell in love with this house as soon as I saw that it said "For Sale by Owner" sign right in front of it. I called the number, and they were selling it for $48,000. I thought, my God, this is cheap for such a beautiful home. I moved in,
I have a 9-year-old son and 1 cat. About the end of July, I started hearing and seeing things. To begin with, I was laying in bed one night, and my 9-year-old and 6-year-old, who was visiting from California, were asleep in their rooms. All the lights were out. My bedroom door meets the living room. I was lying on my left side looking out into the black of the living room, and I heard what sounded like someone walking in it. Now, my sons sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and come sleep with me, so naturally I thought it was them. I called out their name. No answer. Then I thought maybe it was my cat, but then I noticed her laying at my feet on the bed. It really sounded like someone was walking from the kitchen in the living room entrance towards my room. Second, my television is hooked up to the stereo because the speaker on the TV is blown. Well, when I have to be at work at 11 p.m., I usually take a shower around 9:45 p.m., and my 9-year-old goes over to his father's house. One night, I turned my stereo on and put a disc in it, 5-disc CD changer. It was on disc 4, song number 11. There were 2 songs, and it should have switched to disc 5 after I was done with song 12. I took my shower and had the stereo loud enough to where I could hear it. All of a sudden, I didn't feel the vibration of the music anymore. I thought, well, maybe it's at a quiet part. When I got out of the shower, I still heard nothing. I put my ear to the door. Nothing. I went out and looked at the stereo, and it was not on CD anymore, but on FM radio on 100.1. And that is not a station at all. It's just fuzz. There was no one else in the house but me and my cat. That was on a Friday night. 2 days later, on a Sunday night, my son and I were watching television around the same time, between 9:45 and 10 p.m. In the middle of television, the radio goes from auxiliary to FM radio, 100.1, fuzz. My son says, "Mom, what did you do? I was watching that." I told him I didn't do anything. On a Saturday, my son was at his father's, and I was there alone with the cat, and she started going crazy. At one point, she was standing in the doorway of my room in the living room, looking at me. She meowed and took off like crazy into the back bedroom belonging to my youngest son. She came racing back into the living room. Just then I heard a loud boom coming from the room, like something fell. It shook the entire house. My stomach had butterflies in it then, and I got up to go see. My son won tall dresser with small bionicle toys on it, but they were still all on there. There wasn't anything else that could fall from any place. I've always heard pipes rattling under the house since I moved in. Out of the corner of my eye, I always see things dart quickly about. I haven't seen it fall on, but I know it moves quick. I haven't took pictures of my home yet, or of it for that matter. Also, I have a 2-car garage. Sometimes when me and my son pull up from school, both garage doors are closed. In the morning, sometimes the right one is open. I've never really been a great believer, but for the past 8 or so years, since me and my mom moved from our old flat to our new house, I've experienced numerous experiences. The first when I was about 6. My bedroom is the box room, and so it's small. My bed touches each side of the room with the door to the left. I was laying in bed waiting for my grandma, who was babysitting, to bring me water. I looked up at the wall and saw a strange shadow. It was like a side profile of someone's head. I could see the nose, mouth, and hair clearly. It could have been my own shadow,
since the only light came from the ceiling, and I was lying down in bed. I watched it for a few seconds, then it seemed to fade before my eyes. I thought it was just because I was tired, and so I ignored it. I had no further experiences until 7 years later, in 2003. I was laying in bed once again, the light off about 12 o'clock at night. I was really tired and was trying to fall asleep. My bedroom had been rearranged so that the door was opposite my bed, and one side of my bed was pushed against the wall. I had my back to the wall and was staring into the darkness when I felt a cold breeze on the back of my neck. Thinking it was just a drought, I rolled over the face of the wall. On the wall, probably 3 inches from my face, was another face. I could tell it was a man, and he had a black hood up. All I could see of his face was a pair of cold eyes, and what I can only describe as green paint, a face paint on his cheek. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, thinking I was just seeing things, and when I opened them again, the face was still there. I don't know how long I stared at it, but in the end, I fell asleep, and in the morning, could find no trace of what was there the night before. These sightings carried on for weeks, always appearing on the wall at night. I didn't tell my mom about the face, but asked if I could move my bed back to the original place. We moved it, and I slept peacefully that night. The following night I went to bed about 2 o'clock, since I'd been up watching a movie on television. I got in bed as usual, and rolled over to face the radiator, like I'd done for years, but the face was there again. This time, however, it was more vivid and real. It seemed to be sneering in the dark, and more threatening than before. I rolled over so my back was to the wall, but I could feel the cold breeze that I had felt the last few weeks whenever the face appeared. I pulled the covers around me, refusing to look back at the face. The incidents got less frequent over the weeks, and I believed that the face was going. One night, I was sat at my computer in the corner of my living room. I have a cockatiel whose cage is right next to the computer desk, who was asleep, and my mom was in the kitchen making a drink. I didn't really notice anything until I heard my bird start to hiss and back away into the corner of the cage. Wondering what frightened him, I heard a scraping noise. I looked to the side of the computer to see my glass moving towards the edge of the desk. There was no way it could be moving, because of our house being set on a rise, because it is where it should be sliding the other way. I lifted my hand to stop the glass from falling off the desk. When I touched it, the glass was cold, even though I hadn't had a cold drink in it. The strangest thing was when I went to push the glass back, I couldn't. Something was trying to push the glass. I had to shove it quite hard before I could get the glass to move. When I did, my bird came back to the front of the cage and looked as though nothing had happened. I'd gone to bed earlier than my mom that night and must have been asleep when she came up. Once again, the face was there, but this time, the presence was really strong. My bedroom was icy cold when it normally is the hottest room in the house. Almost 1 o'clock, I wake up shivering and could feel something gripping my arm, but as I come to, it released its grip. I rolled over to see the face once again, but it looked different. The smirk had gone, and it looked more angry than anything else. I didn't sleep that night, and I couldn't sleep in the room, so I spent the night sat on my sofa with the lights on downstairs. When my mom came down in the morning, she was shocked to see me up, but I just said I had woken up early and came down. I didn't want her to know. Later that afternoon, we were having dinner when she asked if I had a nightmare last night. I couldn't recall anything but the face, and a cold hand, so I asked why. She said she had heard me talking in my sleep, which I had never done before that. She said I was telling someone to get away and don't touch me over and over. Then after about 5 minutes, I was quieter and mumbling things like, "Why are you doing this?" and "just go away." When I asked her what time, she said it was about 12:30, just before I woke up with a hand gripping my arm. I haven't seen the face or had any strange experiences since that night, and I'm not quite sure what happened after. I don't know if I did something to make it all go away, and that was why the man's face looks so angry, but I'm glad they're gone. I still expect to see the face every night, but so far I haven't. I finally told my mom about it all, and she asked if I wanted to have the house blessed, but I said no. Although the scary face did no harm to anyone, and it's gone now anyway. My story happened about 2 years ago over a period of 8 months, and I'm so glad I no longer live in the same house. We moved to our current house because we had to, but the happenings in our house just encouraged us even more. As I'm trying to write this, I've just remembered something else that happened when I was 14 years old. My parents split up when I was 14, and my sisters were both 11 and 9. I'd always believed that negative energy could cause occurrences, and so it was no surprise to me when things went a bit strange in our house. First thing that happened was that the TV in my chest of drawers would shake from side to side, which was just not possible. I put it down to reverberations elsewhere in the house, but this was not the case. Second, after returning home one night, I came home and went straight into my room without turning the light on. However, I could see from the light coming in from the hallway. The picture I had on my wall came flying off the wall sideways and hit the door side on, and to this day, there is still a massive dent where it made contact. My younger sister also claimed to have seen the figure of a young girl standing beside her bed one morning. However, I was quick to dismiss it, as I felt as though if I acknowledged it, it would become real. Nothing else happened until 6 years later. We were in our new flat. My mom, me and 2 sisters, and everything was totally normal, up until I'd say about 1 month of being there. Can't really remember the exact order of events, except that last and final one. My sister Jane had told my mom that she had been in bed the night before and had the feeling of someone pushing the covers down at either side of her, like almost trapping her in the bed, but she put it down to being really tired. My mom, being the world's biggest skeptic, said she was havering and to get a grip on reality and to not mention it to her younger sister Gemma, as it would freak her out. She did not tell me also until after a few things happened. A couple of days later, my younger sister Gemma comes to my mom with identical story and automatically assumes they are both in on it and are trying to wind her up, but when both are confronted, denied all knowledge, and my mom began to think along the lines that they may be telling the truth. By now, I know about the whole thing, and so as you can imagine, I'm slightly apprehensive about going to sleep at night. I was in my bed one night, and I had a room of my own, so I was last up in the house, and I think I was reading a book or something. My cat Hajma was laying on the bed, next to my thigh, and leaning on it. I was the only one who allowed him to sleep in my room, because I always felt safer with him there. I heard a noise outside my room, nothing you could really put a name to, and I started to read again, and I looked at Hamish. The next part is a little weird, but I swear it happened. Hamish was lifted 6 inches straight up in the air, still in his curled up position. I freaked. The cat meowed really loudly and ran from the room. I then went into my mom's room because I was slightly petrified. Now, my mom was sure something was happening, yet nothing had happened to her. I was now beginning to think that maybe it was negative energy, again, because this house move had been a result of the breaking up of my parents, and my mom really didn't want to live in the house, and she was miserable, and we were in turn miserable because she was. So 2 months passed with nothing happening, until my sisters and I went to Ireland with my dad on holiday, and left my mom in this house on her own for a week. I phoned my mom whilst we were away, and she seemed on edge, but wouldn't say what was wrong, so that she didn't spoil our holiday, but I had a feeling it was about the house. When we got back, she told me that one night she had went to sleep, and she always kept the bedroom door shut, and the way the doors are, you can't just push them to get in. You have to physically turn the handle, which was good, because it meant my mom could keep the cat out. She said she was just drifting off to sleep, and she felt the bottom corner of the bed being depressed, as if someone had just sat on it. She thought at first it was the cat, and had gotten to the room, but when she put the light on the door, it was still completely closed. She then put it down to her imagination, and tried to fall back asleep. Then she felt the same feeling of the covers being pushed down at either side of her, and she also felt a pressure on her chest, like someone was sitting on it. She tried to sit up but couldn't, and she also couldn't reach the bedside lamp, and the next thing she knew, something hit her really hard in the face, full force, and the chest pressure released instantly. She couldn't sleep again, and that night, she spent the night in my grand's house. We came back from holiday, and I then had to spend the last 9 months sleeping in the same room as my mom, as she was too scared. She was so convinced of something bad in the house that she went as far as to go to the library to check what was on the land previously, as these flats had been up for about 3 years. The library couldn't help, as they had no files. My mom gave up, until my sister met a lady at the bottom of her street who spoke to her unexpectedly and said that she had lived in the area all her life and knew we were new. My sister took the opportunity to ask if she knew what was there before the flats had been. She claimed that the car park to the flats had been once completely sealed with a wrought iron fence over 6 feet high that you could not see through, and the home beyond the fence was that of a scandalized counselor, and there was a lot of mystery surrounding his death. We have since found out that this was true, but there's virtually no information on the counselor or the land on which he lived. Now, needless to say, my mom is not a skeptic, and nothing has happened in her new house. I used to be a police officer for the city of San Benito, Texas. One night, my shift was working 11 to 7, graveyard shift, when I heard one of my fellow officers call out over the police radio at about 2 or 3 a.m. that he was going to check out what appeared to be a fire within the fenced area of the Old City Cemetery, which is located on Old Sam Houston Street. I then advised our dispatcher that I would be en route to back up my fellow officer. I was across town, so I'd traveled about 2 to 3 minutes tops when I heard the officer say 10 to 8, which means back in service. I then thought to myself, why didn't he call for the fire department? So I then called him over the radio and told him to meet me at the parking lot of the Blockbuster video store. When he pulled up to my police unit with his patrol car, I could see that he had a scared look on his face. I asked, "Hey, what happened at the cemetery?" And he said defensively, "I don't want to talk about it." I again asked him what happened to the fire, and he said again, "I don't want to talk about it," and drove off in the police unit. I thought to myself that I would give him the chance to clear his thoughts from his head, so I waited to the end of the shift to ask him what had happened. He told me that he was patrolling on North Sam Houston Street when he saw a small fire in the Old City Cemetery. He then stated he went around the railroad tracks at Old Sam Houston Street. Since it was around one of the holidays when they sell fireworks, he thought someone might have set off the fireworks and it had landed in the cemetery, causing a grass fire. He then called the dispatcher over the police radio and advised her that he was going to check out the fire. He said he told me he exited the patrol unit and walked into the city cemetery towards the fire. He said that the flame from the small fire was about 8 to 9 feet high. He then told me he noticed as he was walking towards the fire that the closer he got to the area of the flame, the smaller it was getting. He said to me when he got up where the source of the fire was, it suddenly disappeared, and he noticed that there was no smoke or traces of anything burning. He stated that when he looked down where the flame had disappeared, he was standing in front of a grave where had just been buried days or a couple of weeks before. He then stated that he felt scared, and that is when he got back in his patrol car and left the area. This occurrence is my one and only paranormal experience. I'd love to have more. For the past year, I've had a part-time job working for an ambulance company. This company is one of the few running combination funeral home EMS services in the region. One day, I was sitting in the ambulance bay, resting between calls. The ambulance bay is in the same building as the embalming and body preparation area. I was in a meditative state, but had my eyes open. Out of the corner of my eye, I observed a girl about 9 years old walk through the back wall of the ambulance bay towards me. I remained motionless, and when she arrived at my side, she smiled and blew a puff of air onto my cheek. I could distinctly feel the breath, and at this point, I realized that day I was not daydreaming. The child was dressed in a slate blue jumper with a white blouse. The outfit she wore could have placed her anywhere from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. It looked like a school uniform. She was slender, with mousy brown hair and dark eyes. After blowing on my cheek, she smiled and walked past where I was sitting and disappeared through an exterior wall just to the left of a door. Later, I asked some of the other paramedics if this apparition was familiar to them. It was not. However, 2 of the medics stated that they have seen and or heard ghosts in the ambulance bay building and an adjacent former residence, now used as a dispatch center. Although I've tried sitting in the same place and being quiet and meditative, I've failed to see the little girl again, but I will keep trying. There was no fear involved with the paranormal event, only a sense of love and gentleness. Thanks for reading. I had a few experiences in this one house I lived in from the time I was 5 until about 14. I lived in a city about 20 minutes away from Los Angeles. Anyway, one night, I was sleeping and for some reason I woke up. I don't ever wake up in the middle of the night. When I woke up, I saw a white figure, which looked like a soldier standing in front of my bedroom door. He was just standing there saluting me, just staring at me, and he didn't move. What I remember the most is his eyes. They were bright white. I was scared because yeah, it was a ghost, and it's not normal for me to see something like that, but at the time, I felt safe. I knew that he wasn't there to hurt me or he wasn't trying to scare me. What I wanted to do was run to my mom's room, but instead, I pulled the blanket over my head and prayed. The next morning, I told my mom about it, and I remember she got this weird look on her face, but then was like, "It must have been the lights from outside. You probably imagined it. Now stop scaring your sister." After that, everything was fine until about a year later, I had the worst experience. My mom had rearranged my room so that my bed was right in front of the door. One night, I was sleeping and I heard what sounded like a baby wearing a diaper crawl by. My baby brother still wore diapers, so I thought it was him. I looked out my bedroom door and didn't see anything. I checked on my baby brother and he was sound asleep in his crib. I went back into bed and started to doze off when I heard it again. I didn't feel like getting up again, so I called out his name, and just like that, the noise stopped. Then about 10 seconds later, I felt something tug on my blanket. Now remember, my bed was right in front of my door, so if my brother came in, I would have seen him. I grabbed onto my blanket, but whatever was tugging started pulling on it harder. I was so scared, but I wasn't about to let whatever was pulling me on my blanket take it. That's my favorite blanket, so I laid on top of it. Then the tugging stopped. I guess I passed out because I woke up again on top of my blanket. Something had woke me up. I didn't know what though. Anyway, I had long hair and it was hanging off of my bed because of the way I was laying. All of a sudden, I felt like something was pulling my hair very gently though. Then all of a sudden, it felt like someone had started at the top of my head and put their fingers through my hair, but it didn't feel like fingers because it scratched my head. It was sharp. I know I was not imagining it either because my head jerked back since I had a lot of tangles to my hair. That was it. I ran so fast out of my room. I ran into my parents' room crying hysterically. It took them a while to calm me down. When they finally did, I told them what happened. Again, My mom told me it was my imagination. I was not imagining it. Well, I slept on their room floor for about 6 months after that. There was no way I was going to sleep in that room. That was the last time anything bad happened like that. I remember I was always freezing in my room. The rest of the house would be hot, but as soon as you would go into my room, you were freezing. No matter what time of the year it was. One day, me, my mom, my brother and sister came back from my aunt's. I was the first to walk in. My mom was right behind me, and bro and sis were still getting out of the car. It was dark in the house, so I was walking to go put the light on, when out of nowhere, this bright white ballish figure flew straight from the kitchen into my room. My mom saw it too, because I looked at her, and all she said was, "Don't say anything." We finally moved when I was about 14. One day, my mom and I were talking about that house, and I brought up that soldier I'd seen. That's when she finally told me what happened. The street we lived on had this one gang. They were always doing drive-by shootings, fights, and cops everywhere. Anyway, a year we both moved in, I guess there had been a little shootouts between the gangsters and the cops. Well, a cop was shot, and he called up to my front porch to get help, but before an ambulance could get there, he died right there on the steps. My bedroom window was right next to the front porch, so it turned out that it wasn't a soldier, but it was a cop dressed in full service dress that he was buried in. I actually felt fortunate to have had him with us. I feel like he was protecting us. A lot of the kids on my street that I grew up with had been beat up bad, shot, joined a gang, got pregnant really young, etc. Everyone except for me and my siblings. There's 6 of us. It was a dangerous neighborhood, but I always had this feeling when I was in that house, like I was safe and I had nothing to worry about. But at the time, I always felt like something or someone was watching me. Well, that's my story.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another edition of Phantom of Darkness's Ghost Stories. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and share the video. As you can hear, my voice is not really cooperating, and that means I'm going to have to see the doctor, so I love you. Hope you don't mind the video, and I'll see you in the next one.